Morning. We are in the, October 11th today. Welcome to the October Finance and Operations Committee meeting of the Board of Regents. We've got a lot on our plate. Before we start, I am going to call on our student regents joining us at the Horseshoe up here today. Representative Petoulas. Close.
Petoulas. Thank you, Regent Anderson. Great to be here today and excited to hear what we have to talk about.
All right. And Student Representative Dean, do you want to just tell us a little about yourself? We've heard it all probably already. You've been here a long time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chair Anderson. So my name is Marta Dean. I'm here representing the Crookston campus. I'm a double major in agriculture, business, and communication, and I will be graduating this May.
Thank you very much. We are going to get started. We've got a lot to do. Our first item on the agenda today is we are going to be taking action on the President's recommended 2021 biennial budget request. Those of you who are presenting this topic may want to step to the table as you're doing that. Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Brian Burnett to tee this up for us and start off.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Today before you is the recommended request for the biennial budget request to the state of Minnesota for fiscal year 2021. It builds on priorities that President Kaler has discussed with you previously. We went over this quite a bit at the last meeting, at the September meeting. Quite frankly, this has a strategy that the university's mission and vision is its foundation. We call on the state to recognize its opportunity to share in the success of this institution. And it acknowledges the true cost this institution faces just to remain in place, to maintain quality, to preserve the unique experience this offers our students. And we also believe this request is fiscally responsible and sensitive to the competing priorities for funding at the state level. It strives to be simple, straightforward, as well as compelling. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn it over to Associate Vice President Julie Tonneson and Vice President Matt Kramer to go through the remainder of the slides. Thank you.
Vice President Tonneson.
Mr. Chair, members, I will very briefly outline and summarize our proposed request. As you recall from the September agenda item on this topic, the strategy we brought to you for review was one of constraint and priorities, and Senior Vice President Burnett just outlined some of the advantages to that strategy. It is a request built on a plan for shared responsibility, in addition to potential tuition revenue gains and a continuing commitment to significant internal reallocations. We are asking the state to provide an increase to our core funding support of $30 million in the first year of the biennium and an additional $27 million in the second year. That would result in a 6.7% increase to our general fund biennial appropriation, an $87 million increase in biennial math on a base of just under $1.3 billion. The core funding support would help us to provide competitive compensation rates to our talented faculty and staff, which is a high priority for the university. And in addition to that, we would work through the annual budget process to identify and fund the highest priorities across all 5 campuses in compliance activities, in maintaining excellence in our research activities, and in programming for students. And that across all of those includes addressing critical facility, equipment, and technology needs. The state appropriation increase we're proposing, if funded, will allow the President and you, the Board of Regents, to make those strategic priority decisions through the budget process without reducing the breadth and depth of the university's impact or sacrificing quality. With that, Mr. Chair, we offer this resolution for your action and would be happy to respond to any further questions you have on the request.
Thank you. I think before we get any farther, I'm going to ask that if someone will move the resolution, and we'll get that on the table, and then we can talk.
So move.
Second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded for the resolution in front of us for the biennial budget request. Is there any discussion? We did have review last month. It looks like review went pretty well, evidently. Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Regents. Mr. Kramer, has this been vetted with legislative leaders, this proposal? And if so, has there been any feedback at this point, what our request is going to be? And I can't say with the governor because we don't know who the governor is going to be, but with folks in St. Paul.
Vice President Kramer.
Mr. Chair, Regent Johnson, yes, but I would say at a very high level. As you know, on the House, the leadership and across the board are up for election, and it's on a practical basis a little bit hard for them to plan into this future. I would say that what we've done is we've teed this up with the legislature in St. Paul, not in opposition to, but in contrast to Minnesota State's request. Since our last meeting, Regents, Minnesota State has introduced their budget request of $246 million, in stark contrast to the University of Minnesota's. They're asking for a 17% increase as opposed to our 6.7%, and they have specifically called out, as Associate Vice President Tonneson did, that this covers both compensation, inflationary cost increases, as well as they're attempting to close their structural budget deficit with state funding.
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, further, once, assuming this resolution passes, we move forward, we get through the election, what is the strategy for this in regard to, say, the Alumni Association, the donor base, and say the Minnesota Business Partnership, Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, and those very important stakeholders, how to communicate the importance of this budget?
Vice President Kramer.
Mr. Chair, Regent Johnson, there is a robust communication strategy with all of our constituent groups, alumni, business associations, across the board in Minnesota to demonstrate the need of the University of Minnesota. It will be robust, it will be engaging, and as I'm sure you know, there may be changes to this given that this is being done in advance of the election.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any further discussion? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, presenters. I think I heard you mention the word quality. I'm just wondering, how are we measuring quality when we talk about it in those terms?
Vice President Kramer, Vice President Tonneson.
Mr. Chair, Regent Hsu, I was referring to our ability to maintain our current programs at the quality level they are today without having to do significant programmatic or programmatic type reductions that would impact the quality.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was very interested when Minnesota State rendered their request, and wondering if you could just speak a little bit to your expert analysis of how that lays out. I mean, we understand that there are three entities that are really continuously competing, and I mean, I think that's the honest word for the higher education funding that the state is committing on an annual basis or biannual basis, and we have seen our relative position shift a bit in recent years, and not to the university's better interest that way. Do you see any challenges with a stronger request? Because as we've talked about at this table, at times the legislature appears to sort of take everyone's requests and take a certain percentage, and based on this as a relative matter, are we going to be in a strong position to make the case? Are we hoping to appeal to the better judgment of the legislature that they're going to be more analytical than to just go on a percentage basis? What is your assessment of our request, and would there be a basis for us to look at the structural changes in our support from the state at the same time?
Vice President Kramer, you're nodding your head.
Mr. Chair, Regent Rocha, first of all, I would go back to the first part of your statement, in competition. I couldn't agree more, and I've often made the point, I think on a regular basis, individuals perceive that somehow higher education in general is quote unquote under attack from the state, and I absolutely disagree with that premise. Not only is the Office of Higher Education, Minnesota State, and the University of Minnesota in competition within the higher education budget, higher education is in competition with all the other needs of the state. And so much as Regent Rocha noted, it's fair to say that the state has certain priorities. We think of public safety and public health that typically rise to the top, or K-12. higher education historically has been one of the last items to be decided on, just in part because I'm not saying it's less important, but there are higher value things that legislators would want to address first. And obviously, Regent Johnson or Regent Swigum could comment more on that in terms of leadership. I would say to Regent Rocha's comment, I feel very confident that what we have done is we have teed up I'll say it, a reasonable strategy. What Minnesota State has done is tee up a very needs-based strategy, and curiously, they're attempting something that we asked the legislature last year to do. And I brought this quote with me. Laura King, who's their chief financial officer, said something along the lines of what a tuition increase would raise for Minnesota State. In fact, a 3% tuition hike for them raises about $67 million. And her exact quote is, if the legislature and the governor can meet our targets, then we would pledge not to raise tuition. Regents, as you know, last year with the legislature, we very directly went to leadership, majority, minority, and the governor, and said, if you will help us out, we will not, if you'll cover what would have been a tuition increase, we won't raise tuition. And again, for any number of reasons, not the least of which is the legislature has plenty of other priorities, they were unable to really address that. It's not a political decision. I think it's very much a function of where state dollars are available. I find it curious that Minnesota State would try the same thing we did last year.
And Regent Roche, have a follow-up, and then we'll move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would describe what we did last year a little differently, because we said if you meet these numbers, we will hold tuition, but it was stacked on top of a whole bunch of other things. If these things are all funded first, then we would look to do this. And I don't know if that's what Minnesota State is doing this year. I didn't look at it that closely to make that assessment, but I'll just conclude with the comment that I appreciate your remarks, and I think that's an accurate description of that constant competition. And obviously, the Office of Higher Education has really changed the landscape. That's funding that would have gone directly to the systems in the past. But I think that the more we can be clear, when you're operating under the perception at the legislature that the university is well compensated it is certainly among categories. When you lead with this is for compensation, purposes first, it's not going to come off as much as a need versus all these other competing interests that have, $45,000 a year, masters of social work dealing with children with addiction from birth, and those are going to have, I think, a much stronger emotional pull. So we really need to hone that message to make sure the legislature understands that these are critical needs. Thank you.
Okay, we got one more speaker, I guess. Regent Swigum, welcome.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I apologize for the lateness.
That's okay.
I apologize for that.
We have a motion on the table, just so you're aware.
Just very, very quickly, Mr. Kramer, Vice President Kramer, I just want to add that I think this request is extremely reasonable of the legislature and of the public of the state of Minnesota, especially in comparison to which I thought 2 years ago our request was fairly large, fairly inflated over our needs. I just want to make a comment on, I think you're probably going by this, on page 5 of the presentation before we get to the resolution. You list out 3 different choices. Maybe you don't, okay, well, the 3 choices you lay out and consequences are on page 5, raise tuition on students or reduce the breadth and depth of the universities, impact the quality, or reduce quality in some cases, in some areas. Humbly, let me just suggest that those are not the only 3 choices. I do not buy that we cannot become more efficient and maintain our mission and our quality. I do not buy that. So I just want to add that I think there are more than 3 choices and consequences, but I know you went by that. I just needed to add that. I think the request is reasonable.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. Senior Vice President Burnett, you want to a final comment, and we'll take a vote.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Regent Rocha, we did have, I did personally have a conversation with a longtime senator who has influence and decision-making around the state budget, and talked with her about our strategy in this regard. And she was very supportive, and she thought that coming forth with something that they could afford that would make sense to them was indeed a strategy that she could support. So who knows how it all goes from here, and who knows who's in charge. I would also say this is a placeholder. If we get a new administration that asks the university to look at something new, we obviously are going to listen to that. So there's just a lot of change underway, obviously, at St. Paul and here as well. So I think in that regard, taking care of the core, putting forth this piece of what we do is the strategy, I think, it positions us best for success. So thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, we're going to call for the vote. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would staff remind me as to whether the MnDrive money is that embedded inside the appropriation request at this point?
Do you have an answer to that, Alice?
If it is, it's the intention to continue that.
Mr. Chair, Regent Beeson, yes, the MnDrive funding has all been to this point recurring, and therefore it is part of the base, the $1.3 billion base that we are asking for an increase on top of. It's in there.
Thank you. Thanks, Regent Beeson. Okay, at this time, we are going to be taking a vote on the resolution related to the state biennial budget request for fiscal year 2021 as presented. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We are now going to go to the President's recommended 6-year capital plan and the 2019 state capital request. Again, we reviewed this last month, so this is for action. President Kaler, would you like to introduce the topic?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are here today to seek your approval of my recommended 6-year capital plan and the 2019 state capital request. And so I will introduce for the presentation Brian Burnett and Mike Bertelson, Vice President for University Services. So Brian and Mike, over to you, please.
Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. As we described at your September meeting, the 2018 6-year capital plan includes 5 priority areas. We first want to address the backlog of poor and critical space. 50% of our buildings are over 50 years old, and 8.5 million square feet of buildings need renewal. This cuts across every theme of this plan, anchored by HEAPR and supported by decommissioning of some of our worst space, someday decommissioning the Mayo building in the Academic Health Center. Second, we want to advance the health sciences. 35% of our poor and critical space is in our health sciences portfolio. Last month, Vice President Tolar described the vision for the Health Science Center. We can't do it with space that's 35% poor and critical. Third, we'd like to modernize the St. Paul campus research labs. We spent time with you last month updating the board on our strategic facilities plan for St. Paul, its early results. The 6-year plan aims to greatly improve the condition and quality of the St. Paul research labs through standalone projects and targeted HEAPR investments. Fourth, we'd like to expand the capacity in STEM programs. Student demand, as well as state performance measures related to STEM degrees, have increased the need for teaching lab facilities. Chemistry is a core component, and this plan includes a major investment in the Twin Cities campus chemistry. You may also recall we made a recent investment in the Duluth campus's ability to deliver chemistry with the Heikola building that is coming online here soon. And fifth, we need to reposition our libraries as they remain the center of campus scholarship and exchange via flexible teaching, learning, and collaboration spaces rather than places to store stacks of books. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Vice President Bertelson to walk you through the remainder of the plan to remind the board what we brought forth last month. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Vice President Bertelson, if you will.
Mr. Chair, Regents, this is my slide just to remind us of the challenge that we continue to face with deferred capital renewal that challenges and puts risks for the campus on our programs regarding safety and functionality of our programs, and the continued focus of this 6-year plan to address that need. The 6-year plan highlights, of course, $200 million in each of the years, which is addressing our actual need on an annual basis to try to keep up with the aging of our facilities, continuing with the board priorities with the from the previous years and from last month that we brought to you, placeholders for the St. Paul campus, Greater Minnesota, and other strategic priorities, and the major new investment that we outlined last month regarding health sciences. There are no changes to the projects that you have in front of you from last month. The only change at all has been we did change the projected year from a Turkey research facility sooner in the project as we do more continued planning for the U-More site. In addition, this capital identifies a capital request for the next legislative session. These are the same projects and dollar amounts we presented to you last time. The $200 million for HEAPR, the $42 million for the Institute for Child Development, and moving ahead with the one project that was not funded in the last capital request in Duluth, the A.B. Anderson renovation. One specific note is I know that there was conversations, announcements about the progress toward childcare on the Twin Cities campus. That announcement has not changed this project at all. This is what was there last year. That project is exactly the same. And the only changes that we're considering are about the existing child development site, not the ICD building itself. So that brings us to the resolution. This is again an all funds 6-year capital plan per board policy and directs staff to advance the planning toward these projects and advance the state capital requests for next session. And with that, I will sit for questions.
Did you present both the resolutions on there?
I attempted to.
Okay, I was looking here, and I just wanted to make sure, because I see we had a robust discussion about this last month, and there's no reason when I ask for a motion, we can't ask for a motion and second for both resolutions at the same time and then talk about them. And so at this time, I am going to ask for a motion to recommend the 6-year capital plan and the 2019 state capital request, if there is.
So moved.
Seconds. Moved and seconded. We'll now have a discussion. Anybody have questions on the capital plan? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I'm not sure where this question goes. It should go. But my question is, so this is a request, and this assumes that there's going to be a bonding bill this year. Is there a reason? I mean, is there a reason for us to be hopeful that this will be funded this year?
Vice President Bertelsen, do you want to answer that?
Mr. Chair, Regent Hsu, the history is that there almost every year is some sort of bonding bill. Of course, the even years tend to be the focus for a significant and major bonding request, but there almost always is one, and we feel important, have felt that it's important to have when it comes up, if there is one, for our priorities and for your priorities as a board to be clear, to give us direction for how to respond to that.
Thank you, Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Just another question regarding you had mentioned that since the last meeting, there had been some announcements and decisions made on the child care center. And my understanding with that is that the Shirley G. Moore School, lab school, or lab, whatever it is going to be moved to the CDC. And originally that was part of the ICD project at its current location. So how much is it going to cost to move it to the CDC? And then is there can you give us an idea of what how that would actually work at the CDC site?
Vice President Bertelsen.
Mr. Chair, Regent Hsu. So one clarification is the ICD project as defined and brought to the board never included the lab school. The lab school is part of the existing facility in the Knoll, but in the renovation plans, it was always assumed that it would have to go somewhere. The question was where. And that led to the series of conversations about childcare, thinking that would be, initially the thought was that would be the home strictly for the lab school. Through evaluation, now the plan is that the CDC becomes the home of the lab school, but those two programs are integrated to become sort of a new lab school at the CDC and expanding the number of people. So the planning, we've begun a pre-design to identify how those programs would be integrated, both the college from a programmatic perspective and from capital planning. We're identifying what kind of addition is the right size to meet the existing total number of combining those two projects. We don't have a specific number for you yet because we're doing the planning and programming for that. That will mean that project will then come back to you either as a capital budget amendment or as part of the next year's annual capital budget.
Fair to say that that is still in the planning stages and not, I mean, what you're saying, it's certainly not set in concrete.
No.
Okay.
Can I have one more follow-up, please?
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair. So what I'm hearing, and I like the idea of moving the lab school and preserving the CDC and having them both there. But my question then is, if we get the money for the Institute of Child Development, but yet we don't have a plan for what's going to happen with the lab school, what's going to happen once we start construction on the ICD?
Vice President Bertelsen.
Mr. Chair, Regent Hsu, we have a sketched out schedule for how that would work. We believe that the two programs could be integrated even before the addition at the CDC would happen. Then we're working out how that would happen. In addition, if we got the money for the ICD, we've done a pre-design to date. So it would be approximately a year from time we would get the money, which is usually at the end of the session, before you would be ready to start construction. In the meantime, we think the CDC site, you could actually begin to merge those programs even before an addition, although the preference would be to try to do that. The addition there will not be as complicated of a project, and it would allow existing program to continue while we would do an addition to expand the capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, Vice President Bertelsen. So a question on the medical infrastructure priorities. So between our last board meeting and this one, we had a special meeting where the board approved the new agreement between the university physicians in Fairview, which is, I think, which we all think is very exciting and very positive, and also potentially will set the stage for probably lots of new thinking on, the strategic way forward for that enterprise. And so I guess the question is, and I apologize if you discussed it at the last full board meeting, is there any sense that the investment priorities may change over the next 6 to 12 months just as a result of the fact that we have a new agreement, and it's a fresh agreement, and it does set the stage for rethinking the priorities of that enterprise, or are those investments really going to go ahead independent of? I mean, are they felt to be independent of any revision to the agreement that we got with Fairview?
Vice President Bertelsen.
Mr. Chair, Regent Powell, I would say that I believe the plan as we outlined for investment is aspirational, of course, and significant. And we are at the sort of put forward to you as a board the big idea. And with your approval of that big idea, we will continue to refine. We have a lot of work to advance design and refine the details of that. I think the continued conversation that's coming from your action to move ahead with the next stage of the mHealth work with Fairview will certainly refine the details about how we proceed. I think the general direction is been alignment, and we've been anticipating that direction for some time and have begun pretty detailed conversations with Fairview about how we can advance both their facility needs, ours, and our joint needs. So I think the direction is very consistent in advancing that foundation, and we met just this week again with Dr. Toller and sort of confirmed that the direction and components that we have are pushing us to the right direction and setting us up for, I think, what would be in the future the next wave of investment as well. So I think those components are very consistent and in line.
All right, thank you.
President Kaler, did you want to briefly clarify?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Vice President Bertelsen, of course, is right as always, but one thing this board will need to keep in mind going forward is the fairly bright and distinct line between an investment that, in partnership with Fairview, influences the competitive landscape of healthcare in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and we simply cannot be in a position of investing state funds in a way that differentiates us in a good way in that competitive space. So we will need to do that. Certainly, our investments in research spaces are very clear and are laid out in this plan. Our joint venture through mHealth in the surgery center, which is, of course, on our land, we financed, and they mHealth then leases from us, is a clear model of what we might do going forward. But you will always need a little bit of a litmus test about where that investment is in the healthcare, let me call it retail, provision of care to Minnesotans.
That's a great reminder for us to remember. Regent Simonson.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. You may have answered this, but just so I'm clear on it, I'm looking at the project titles, and this is a 6-year plan, and I'm assuming things can change. I had the privilege this week of excuse me, of visiting the Crookston campus. I saw the new research lab up there. It's very, very important to have that. I could see other things that could change over time there to expand the capacity, et cetera. So I'm assuming stuff can move around. We'll have regular updates on this. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Regent Simonson, that's correct. We annually update the 6-year plan and through the year, and we pay attention to the academic compact process that goes through the budget and use that to help update the priorities and timing of projects as those progress.
Okay,
thank you. Regent Beeson, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Bertelsen. Following up on Regent Powell's comment about really putting a spotlight on this part of the academic health part of campus and making a big ask a year from now. We've got to make sure that our planning for the area keeps up with the planning for a project. And this 6-year plan talks about, identifies all sorts of projects. When we approved our land use plan last year, we talked about maybe needing to redevelop a couple of the housing sites. So this big ask is going to force a lot of decisions. I'm glad we have some extra land that we're securing through the work with the foundation, but we're going to need to see the planning before a year from now when our major capital request comes in, and this is really the whole ball of wax on the Twin Cities campus. Is that part of that's the dynamic area, as we all know. Thank you.
Any comment on that? Thank you. Okay. At this point in time, we've got 2 motions on the table. We've got a motion for the 6-year capital plan and the 2019 state capital request. We are going to vote on them at once, so they'll both be voted on there. All those in favor of the 6-year capital plan and the 2019 state capital request as presented signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Vice President Bertelsen. We've got a couple items on our agenda coming up. The next couple items kind of run together, in my opinion. The Twin Cities undergraduate R&R tuition update, and then we're going to talk about budget variables and levers. I guess let's go with the first one, which is the undergraduate non-resident, non-reciprocity tuition update, and it's just an update. We're not making decisions today. So I am going to, at some point, to get us back on time, I'll pick a time that we're going to take, if Regents are in the queue to ask questions, we might just have to let that go and go. Regent Svigo.
Chairman, clarification if I could. I thought you said we had 2 items before us that we were going to vote on at once.
We did we not?
And we voted on both of them together?
Yes, I announced that, I believe.
I didn't quite understand.
It was a state capital plan was
the
one.
request and the 6-year budget plan. I didn't.
Yes.
I did misunderstood your words.
Okay. Vote aye on both.
I thought we were voting on them separately when you said at once, but
I'm sorry.
No problem.
Do we need?
Just go back and correct a yes and a no for me then.
Thank you. They both pass, I believe.
I know that, but
Okay.
I didn't realize we were voting on them together.
I'm sorry. I'll try to be
No,
clear
that's
on that. But let's go with let's move on to the undergraduate non-reciprocity, non-resident tuition update. Senior Vice President.
I think President Kaler's going to
President Kaler, did you have a question?
Tee this up.
No,
You're
I'll
gonna tee it up. Okay.
Chair Anderson, I'll just tee it up. This board has been keenly, to understate, the interest in NR tuition over the past several years, and we've made progress towards moving to the middle of the Big Ten. We'll outline in this presentation and the following one our progress and the consequences of that progress. I would encourage you to pay attention to the fact that the net revenue is in fact the amount we charge times the number of students who come, and so both of those variables are important, and you will see that in this presentation and the next one. And the other element that we're bringing forward to you, and I think some of you are perhaps a bit uncomfortable with this, is our need to settle on an NR rate sooner rather than later, so that our recruiters in states outside the blessed state of Minnesota are able to communicate to students what the price tag will be. So these two presentations will tee up that conversation, and I look forward to comments from the board. Thank you.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Vice Provost McMaster and Associate Vice President Tonneson to walk you through the lots of information that they've provided here today. And, you know, I guess I would say that there's no one answer here. There's a lot of different viewpoints, but I do think that as we reposition the price for NR tuition for this campus, it comes with a number of consequences, particularly demographic changes that we're seeing in the Midwest, and they're going to bring that forth for you today to just see that we're in a race with a lot of other schools that have the same goals that we do. And so the consequences of that, I think, have been positive for us, but I think there's also room to understand that we may want to be a bit circumspect about this, and so that'll be reflected in what we bring forth this year as for your consideration today, but vote, as President Kaler said, to consider a vote in December, not today. Thank you.
If you will, presenters.
Yes, Chair Anderson, members of the committee, we're going to cover a fair amount of terrain today in terms of enrollment patterns and tuition. What I thought I'd start with is a bit of a trip down memory lane on where we've been with non-resident tuition over the last decade. In the 1990s, the university began to participate in what was called MSEP. That's a Midwest tuition sharing program, which offered lower tuition to non-residents from participating states. Basically, they would pay 150% of the resident rate. In 2003, the decision was made to shift to a national outreach model where we would be more aggressive in trying to bring in non-resident students. We started this project in Illinois, focusing in the Chicago area, and that grew fairly rapidly. The big item here is in 2008, 2009, when the university renegotiated the reciprocity agreement with Wisconsin, requiring Wisconsin residents to pay the higher Minnesota rate. They'd been paying the lower Wisconsin rate. That enabled the university then to lower the non-resident rate. The decision was made to do this or from 20,000 to about 12,500. That's a project that was called R4000, where basically non-residents paid the tuition, the resident tuition rate plus $4,000. That was in place for a number of years. In 2012, we continued to expand the recruitment into California. In 2016, a decision was made by the board to accelerate the non-resident tuition increases, and so they tipped above 5.5% for incoming freshmen, albeit the sophomores and juniors and seniors were held to a 5.5% increase. And just recently, we've expanded yet again with regional recruiters that are in the New York metro area as well as Texas. This set of activities has resulted in the patterns you see here that you looked at before. Just a few comments on this slide. You can see that over the last 18 years or so, the Minnesota numbers, we're looking at NHS freshmen here, have been trending upward. The reciprocity numbers were trending downward until this year when there was an uptick, a significant uptick, mostly with Wisconsin residents. You can see the national picture of the non-residents. That's been going up fairly rapidly, reaching a peak
in 2017 with almost 1,000 non-resident students joining us on campus. This year there was a significant dip in that number, which you've seen the enrollment data about a month ago. And then you can see a similar type of pattern with international, where there was a purposeful decision made to try to increase the number and percent of international undergraduates. That again went up and reached a peak in 2017 and then took a dip commensurate with non-residents. So if we look at this in terms of a slightly different table, we can see what we try to do in enrollment management is to enroll approximately 65% of the freshman class from the state of Minnesota, approximately 15% plus non-resident, approximately 15% reciprocity, and about 5% or so in terms of international. So over this period of time, it shows you the actual numbers and then how these percentages vary year by year. I don't need to say this, but enrollment management and admissions is art and science, and so we can't land on an exact number. We try to land within a range. Sometimes we're very close, sometimes we're spot on, and sometimes there's some variation. So if we look then at the tuition patterns over the last 3 years from two groups, NR&R domestic and NR&R international, you can again see the patterns here, and in particular I wanted to note fall 2017 and fall 2018. In fall 2017, NR&R domestic, in terms of net tuition, generated about $20.5 million for the university, and international generated about $8 million net. That means we've removed the discounting from the gross tuition. That's what that number represents. This year, you can see that those two numbers dropped from 20.5 to 16.6 and from 8 to 7.1, although you do see that the average net tuition per student went up, which seems obvious because you have higher tuition and fewer students. So we did see this downtick this year. We'll talk about that in a minute in non-resident student enrollment. What were some of the factors we think affected fall 18? Well, we always talk about the shifting geodemographics in the upper Middle West, and there's another slide with a map here that will enhance that point. Every year there's enhanced competition for national students. Every flagship in this country wants to increase the number of non-resident students at their university, and some of these places are very aggressive and, in fact, much more aggressive than we are. We do need to mention that the Minnesota NR&R cost of attendance now is $45,000, so that's what the parent and student sees when they look at our website. That's a big number, and of course there was a 15% push on that last year to get to that $45,000. I know from talking with non-resident students that the non-resident tuition is becoming a major factor in their decision to attend this institution. Last year, fall 17, was the first year using the Common App. We felt we had to shift to the Common App because most of our peers are doing it. We have both an institutional app and a Common App for complicated reasons. Many of our applications were coming in via the Common App, and the yield rates were a bit more unpredictable last year because of that. Finally, we're in the incipient stages of the new markets, New Jersey, New York, Texas. It will take several years, maybe half a decade, to really build those markets year by year. So, as you know, as a geographer, I feel it's obligatory to have a map or two in the presentation. I will also note that due to plate tectonic activity, Alaska and Hawaii are slowly shifting their positions closer to the United States year by year. But you can see the dramatic shift in the geodemographics as you go from 2025 to 2030. Where nationally an increase of about 5% is going to turn into a deficit of about 4%. And you can also see the regional effects of this. Pretty much the entire eastern United States by 2030 will be facing declines in high school graduates. But you throw into that, interestingly, California. We all think of California as a high growth state, not so much anymore with high school graduates. So we pay careful attention to these kinds of trends as we plan for our national recruitment strategy.
Up to this point, the conversation that Vice Provost McMaster has been sharing has been around recruiting of the entering class. However, when we discuss a plan for tuition revenue, we have to shift the analysis to include continuing students as well. It isn't only the freshmen that pay tuition. So this chart displays 4 things for 4 years, for both the domestic NR&R population as well as the international population, and then the two combined. First, it shows gross tuition revenue before institutional discounting. Second, it shows the value of that institutional discounting, the waivers that are offered to these students. Third, it shows the costs within admissions and within global programs for recruiting personnel and activities. And finally, the net revenue for the year after you subtract those discounts and costs. You can see on line 14 that net revenue continues to increase even while the total revenue fluctuates. As Vice Provost McMaster mentioned, the large entering class last year is evident and has contributed to the large growth in revenues from column B to column C. And it also serves to offset some of the impact of this fall's smaller enrollment from a total revenue perspective, because next year they are continuing students. You can see that the total enrollment on line 18 dropped from last year, but remains higher than the 2 years prior, FY16 and FY17, and the revenue per student continues to grow as the tuition rate has increased without being offset by an equivalent increase in the discounting. With this fall's rates, we now rank 12 out of 14 in the Big Ten in terms of tuition and fees combined, and we're very close to number 11, Ohio State. We did implement the 15% tuition rate increase this year that was approved last spring, but because the fees did not increase to that same extent, the overall increase in combined tuition and fees was 14%. That's why you see that on that line. When compared across the schools like this, our strategy to adjust our price is clearly visible. Our 14% increase is significantly more than the next closest in line, which was 6% at the University of Wisconsin. So how do we want to move forward with the recruiting and the tuition rates?
So a few points on our recruitment and goals around NR&R for next year, fall 19. We often view a major goal here as enhancing our geographic diversity. I know from talking with students, they value the fact that we have students from around the country that are in the classrooms with them and around the world. They value both national and international diversity. The national students are excellent students that we bring here in. They have the highest ACT scores. They affect our overall metrics fairly significantly, especially when the numbers are high. We do want to pay attention and improve non-resident retention and graduation rates. It's a heavy loss when we lose one of these non-resident students after we've spent considerable time, energy, and money bringing them here. And so we have a number of programs to make sure that when a non-resident student arrives here, they feel at home in Minnesota and they want to stay for the full 4 years. Finally, we're convinced that an education at this university is as good as any of our peers. And so we want to make sure that the pricing reflects that we're as, at the undergraduate level, we're as good as Michigan and Wisconsin and Berkeley in terms of the education that we provide students. Our plan for next year that we spent a large part of the summer working on is to try to land in the middle in terms of NR&R between fall 17, which ran very high, and fall 18, where we saw a dip. What that means is that our goal is to enroll approximately, again, art and science, 825 national students, 300 international students. When we put that in the big equation and account for retention, graduation, that would give us 5132 continuing students for a total of 6257.
In that context, we prepared a number of models for potential tuition rate scenarios for next fall and are displaying 3 of those models here with their corresponding impact on the net revenues, all based on the enrollment projections that we just outlined. In all cases, we've planned for a tuition rate increase of 5.5% for continuing students, just as we have implemented in the last several years. So with the planned reduction in enrollment of 60 overall that you saw in the previous chart, and an increase in the waiver pool, which gets progressively larger as the rate grows to increase or to recognize the increased cost of attendance. The net revenue gain varied in these 3 models from $5.8 million to $7.9 million. These would be the revenue estimates that we would build into the FY20 budget framework to help address the cost increases we face next year. Note that these models have not assumed an increase in recruiting costs. If the units feel that we need to add recruiting position or events into the schedule, they can bring that forward as an investment request in the budget process, which is starting this month. And we will consider that and may bring it forward as a part of the President's recommended budget for FY20. It would become one of the investments in the FY20 budget. After considering these options, the President is recommending a 10% increase in the NRNR rate for new students entering next fall. The official recommendation and resolution for this change is actually part of the next agenda item. As Chair Anderson mentioned, it's not part of this one, but it does flow directly from the information we've been presenting here, so we felt it was necessary to mention that outcome rather than waiting to discuss it only with the budget variables. This recommendation is not based solely on the revenue gain and how it will aid the budget. It is also based on the continuing goal to set this tuition rate at a level that recognizes the quality of the educational experience for the students as compared to our peers. It is a recommendation made with the full understanding that as we raise the rate in conjunction with the changing geodemographics Vice Provost McMaster outlined just a minute ago, we must be prepared to offer additional discounting awards to potential students and to review and adjust those awarding strategies as the environment continues to change. We did talk about preliminarily a 15% increase potentially for FY20 when we discussed the FY19 budget last spring, but the analysis would show that the revenue gain from jumping from a 15% increase as opposed to a 10% increase is not significant enough to warrant the additional risk it would place on our ability to meet our recruitment goals and targets. In addition, moving to 15% instead of 10% would likely not change our position in the peer comparisons. With the proposed 10% increase for FY20, which you see in the middle column here, and assuming the other schools increase their tuition and fees by 5%, which we believe is a conservative estimate at this point, our rank would shift from 12th to 9th. And because we are being conservative, it may well end up actually in the 8th spot. For a number of reasons, including our geographic location and other things that Vice Provost McMaster could talk about, this is probably a realistic representation of where our pricing strategy should end up. We also forecasted 1 year further to show that dropping back to an increase of around 5% in FY21 would keep us in that 8th to 9th place. We'd be able to maintain that. To jump over Penn State for 7th place would be a big leap and require a much more significant rate increase, perhaps even more than 15% in that year. In closing, we do hope that the information presented here helps to advance the discussion in a number of ways. We tried to point out that we continue to honor our commitment to serving Minnesota students, that the tuition rate alone is not the only driver for recruitment success or failure, that our total revenue and revenue per student in this category has been increasing, and that at this point we feel one more pricing adjustment combined with an enhanced discounting strategy that has to be part of it, that we can get to where we want to be with little to no more risk to recruitment than we have had the last couple of years. And with that, Mr. Chair, we are happy to participate in the discussion.
Thank you. We're going to ask you some questions. It's interesting for me. I'm going to take the first question here, more of a comment. I've looked at this several times, and until I just heard the presentation, and not the sharpest tack here, so it takes a little bit to jog my mind. But we've talked a lot about the 10 or 15% increase on freshmen coming in. And we've struggled, as you said, this year to, I wouldn't call it struggle, but it's tougher to get them. But we're discounting and doing that. The real gain on revenue for the university are those kids that do decide to come, that we retain, that we keep at a 5.5% increase, but, you know, a large increase, because it's 3 times as many, sophomores, juniors, seniors, and we're keeping them for 3 years, and they're paying that 5.5% on the increased freshman admission. So I didn't really realize how much revenue that was bringing in as compared to what we've talked about all the time on just on the freshman rate. Am I concluding that finally correct?
Mr. Chair, yes.
Okay, so it took me a while to get there, but I you know, we spent so much time on the freshman rate, and it's really not the freshman rate bringing us our big revenue. It's the sophomore, junior, senior rate. So thank you, and I'm going to start taking questions. I guess we have Chair McMillan.
Chair Anderson, thank you. A couple observations and then one question. Thank you for presenting the kind of the meat and potatoes analytics here. The economist in me tells me that we are finding the elastic portion of this demand curve, and that we need to, I think really hard about how much further we go. I'll say at the outset, I'm supportive of 10, but cautiously supportive, and I would not support a bigger number, because I feel like what you're telling us is we're getting really close to a point where we may do more harm than good. So that's just a marketplace observation and my initial feedback to my colleagues here, that I can get my head around 10, but I do so with some trepidation. A second thing that I didn't see on your list of factors that we should consider is we play with Minnesota State and the private colleges here a vital role in workforce development, and attracting students that come to Minnesota and then stay in Minnesota is huge given our demographic challenges. So that is a big factor to me, and the business community is constantly in my head, and part of our value equation to this state is integrally wrapped around the idea that we will attract talent, and then the business community will help retain it. So that factors into that, and I don't want to go too far, too hard, too fast, and leave us looking backwards saying, wow, we've now priced ourselves to a point where, one, we're not helping the university's bottom line, and two, we're not helping the state with talent attraction. Here's my question. I don't understand the Common App implications. You had 4 or 5 bullet points there, Vice Provost McMaster, and the fourth or third one was the Common App, and you said something and I didn't catch it. Can you tell me why that is a factor?
Sure. Chair Anderson and Regent McMillan, members of the board. The Common App, of course, is an application, a national application where students can fill it out and then check which institutions they want to apply to. There's a fee for each institution, and normally an additional set of questions. Many of our peers have migrated away from their own institutional app to only using Common App. We use both. Last year was our first push to use Common App extensively because our institutional app wasn't quite ready. So we had a large percentage of the applications last year come in for the first time in the Common App platform. What that meant is we didn't have historical knowledge of yield rates and behavior as clear an idea as we did with our own institutional app, which we've been using for decades. So it was a pilot, and we knew we had to do that eventually, use the Common App to get into that space, and we knew there'd be some uncertainty around that the first few times we did it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Cohen.
Thanks, Chair Anderson, and thanks, presenters. I'm a little worried about the 10% increase, but I suppose I can be persuaded. However, this is a question I think I've been asking for several times. When students and families look at the sticker price, they see a certain price. I know that we discount that, but how many students and families understand about discounting initially, and does that keep people from applying because our sticker price is pretty high? And some of the kids I talk to don't understand what discounting means. And, oh, well, I'm supposed to apply and then they're going to give me less, and then it's going to cost less. So how do we inform people that discounting is part of the process?
Chair Anderson and Regent Cohen, members of the committee, you're spot on the knowledge base that a lot of families have. Some families are pretty savvy if they have brothers and sisters that have gone to college or parents are involved in higher ed, but a high percentage of families don't know how this game is played, and that in fact it's the car dealer model, right? That there's the price that's listed, and then we will provide discounting. Now, some institutions will give you guaranteed discounting that's on the website. So they'll say if you have an ACT of X and a high school rank of Y, we'll automatically give you a $4,000 scholarship. We don't do that because we do holistic review and we look at the entire record. So many families would have uncertainty about the process, and they certainly would, or a percentage undoubtedly would not bother to apply at $45,000, which is the first number they see. That said, a large percentage of non-residents will receive some type of discounting and or merit scholarship aid. It's after they submit the FAFSA in the late fall, early spring, and they get their first EFANS letter, that's the scholarship letter, financial aid letter, they'll learn about the discounting. But that is an area that causes problems for us.
Thank you. Regent Svigum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Vice President McMaster, I for one plan to be very supportive of President Kaler's recommendation for the 10%, at least for a number of reasons, which I will not go into. But what I'm interested in is recruitment. Adding efforts in New Jersey, New York, and Texas, I believe. How many persons do we plan to add in their recruiting efforts?
Yeah.
Vice Provost.
Yes, Chair Anderson, Regent Swigum, members of the committee. We have already hired and positioned one regional recruiter in the New York metro area and one regional recruiter in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The intention is that individual will be covering the entire state of Texas, which is a lot of terrain. We have one regional recruiter in Southern California, and we have a recruiter that is based in the Twin Cities but spends a lot of their time in Chicago and Northern Illinois. We, compared to a lot of our peers, are still behind in terms of the recruitment effort and staff members that we send out to do this kind of recruitment.
Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up then, Mr. McMaster, when Regent Lucas and I moved in some people to their new dorms, their new home here in late August, I believe it was. I remember it was a rainstorm going on. Four of the first five we moved in were non-resident, NR. And they were here simply because their parents had been alumni of the University of Minnesota. I think in all four cases, Peggy, their parents had been alumni, which is the direct connection, the reason they were here. I look at the chart you have on page 62.
I don't have that.
We don't have the same page numbers. Sorry, can you tell us what you chart?
It's the one that has enrollment goals. And it says we're looking at goals of domestic increase of a margin of 99% increase. But the goal is we're going to lose more than that of continuing students. I'm just wondering, the marginal increase of 99, losing 169 as a goal. I'm just wondering if we aren't better with serving our students that are here and trying to keep them that are here, as opposed to enhancing our recruitment efforts in New Jersey. don't know what kid from New Jersey is going to come to Minneapolis unless he or she had a mother or father that graduated here. I think it's a tough recruitment. I wonder if we're not better, Julie, in putting our resources into keeping the students that are here in our as opposed to the New Jersey or Texas effort. Just a thought. And
does this deal at all, before you answer that, with class sizes of outgoing seniors, incoming freshmen? Is that part of the goal?
Some of it, yes. Yeah, Chair Anderson and Regent Swigum, that's always an interesting conversation in enrollment management and admissions. Again, if you look down the road at the picture, the geodemographic picture over the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to have to build those pipelines to maintain our enrollments and our metrics. And so, yes, actually, we do attract students from New Jersey and New York, and the Alumni Association helps admissions and tapping into the alumni networks there. We do attract students from California. At one point in time, aside from Illinois, California was our major contributor of students outside the upper Middle West. Because of the strength of our academic programs and the reputation of the university and the quality of the Twin Cities as a place to live, we do have some success. We're also swimming upstream against the fact we're the Great White North. We're flyover land, and there are a lot of geographies that don't understand the quality of what goes on here. But it's essential we enter into this space.
President Kaler, I think, wanted to clarify something there.
Please, I'll yield to Regent Swigum.
Okay, Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. McMaster, I buy what you're saying. I think the outreach is important. I'm just wondering if we don't need to second or enhance our efforts to keep that 169 we're planning to lose here. We've already put resources into them. We've got them here. I'd rather keep the folks we have than try to outreach to a market, which I think is going to be extremely difficult.
Just one correction. That doesn't mean we're going to lose those students. What that just means is in our retention, graduation modeling, given the number of students who came in last year and the downtick, if you add all that together, that's the kind of the change from the prior year. And we have all kinds of efforts to make sure that we will retain our non-residents.
Good, and I respect that goal, but I appreciate the efforts into retention of our.
Absolutely.
We don't want to lose a kid once we got him here.
Absolutely.
EVP Tonneson, was that your comment?
Yes,
okay,
yes,
thank
Mr.
you, because I know you wanted to comment. President Kaler, did you want to comment?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. The word quality was alluded to earlier, and we sometimes tend to focus on cost. The two of the students I moved in on that rainy August day before Regent Swigum and Lucas showed up for work was one family from New Jersey who moved here to study chemical engineering, and another from Ohio who moved here to study early childhood development. Those are two of our very strongest programs, and they moved here for that reason. So again, I would so encourage this board to focus on the quality of what we do, not just the cost.
Thank you. We're going to continue to go here. I do want to say, like I said, this is going to run into the next one. So by about 9:15, we want to be done with this section and keep moving. So if we could be concise in our comments, everybody wants to talk, so I want to get there. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple comments back to my colleagues, Regent Cohen. I would say the hurdle that we face here is the same hurdle that others were charging more face between the gross and the net, and they do seem to be able to do that. And Regent Swigum, on the issue of recruitment and Vice Provost McMaster, it concerns me that we're still behind in the number of recruiters. You know, we've talked about this, and because we're at the bottom quartile, I think we should be out resourcing on the recruiting side. And, you know, recruiting, everything I've heard is recruiters pay for themselves. And you only need, each recruiter needs to get 10 new students or some number. So I hope as we can make up ground. Part of the takeaway in the reading was our competitors are focusing on their own NR because international students are harder to get. So they're putting more boots on the
That's
ground,
right.
if you will, right? And now, on the issue of signaling a fixed increase, I support this approach of doing it in the fall. I know it gets us ahead of the budget, but if our recruiters are telling it that it helps them to have certainty with an increase, I support it. I do agree with Regent McMillan and others. 10%, I will support 10%. It feels aggressive, but we need another year or two of data to know whether we have hit a point of elasticity. And I think 10%. The trends are a little concerning, but you can't really change direction after only 1 year. Question I would have, Regent Omari is not here, so I would ask the question for him whether our diversity numbers, and most of us want to support this for market rate sort of reasons, but he had pointed out, I believe, concern about having an impact on diversity. My question to you would be about the increase we have in reciprocity students. And last year at this time, you told me that the number of students being admitted to Madison was down. At the same time, we're increasing the number of kids from Wisconsin. So what's happening with University of Wisconsin-Madison? Are they admitting? Have they stabilized the number of admittances from Minnesota?
Chair Anderson, Regent Beeson, members of the committee. Wisconsin, it changes their rules periodically, and so we watch this carefully. They have an obligation now to bring in a certain number of Wisconsin residents, a higher number than before. And if they hit that metric, and I forget the exact number, their freshman class is slightly larger than ours, then they're allowed to bring in as many non-residents as they can. It's an incentive for them to maintain access for Wisconsin students. So in fact, they have been increasing the number of Wisconsin residents over the last few years. There's another part of your question that I'm missing though. Was diversity. I'm sorry. Was your question also on diversity?
Going back to the Wisconsin, we need to take that offline or have a different conversation. If we're getting out of balance with that school and our school, and because that should be an equitable number. The question was on NRNR diversity numbers. Have those changed since we've been increasing rates?
In terms of diversity, probably 70 to 75% of the diversity in the freshman class is really shaped with Minnesota residents. We work very hard to attract students of color, low-income, first generation from our own state. So we don't have a large percentage of students of color that arrive from non-resident states. So as we maintain or increase the number of non-residents, it really will have little effect on diversity. The other point about Wisconsin is that they also had a fairly significant, as you saw, non-resident increase last year, which affected some of their numbers.
Thank you. Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. So I really echo most of the comments that have been made by by fellow regents, accept the 10% recommendation, but a bit queasy about it, wouldn't want to go higher, and also support the idea that earlier is better, that the sooner that we can communicate. So I support all that. My question has to do with the next year's goal. I mean, I think that recovering and getting another 100 students versus what you did this year would actually be quite a strong performance. And I would like you to maybe comment a bit on what gives you confidence that that you can really recover quite a bit of momentum as we go into next year. It seems to me like a daunting number.
Yeah, sure. Chair Anderson and Regent Powell, members of the committee, we look at the last 3 or 4 years, and in terms of coming up with these numbers, and our non-resident and international numbers had been going up at a fairly steady rate, somewhat predictable and steady rate. We have the perturbation in 17 with a high number, which is based on some very aggressive discounting we did because the numbers were coming in very low, and we were concerned, and we became aggressive. Last year, we've gone into the reasons we think that they're down. So we're looking at a trend line over the last 4 years, 5 years, and as we look at that trend line, we think that, again, we have 2 anomalous years, and 825 with some extra discounting that the 3rd floor of Morrill Hall is going to provide, with the additional regional recruiters, with the knowledge of how the Common App works. We are fairly confident, I want to be guarded with my language here because I'm going to have to come back and report on this, that we can reach the 825 and the 300. I'm more confident in the 825 than the 300 because with the 300, we're dealing with a whole set of national and climate issues that makes the yield rate from international students very unpredictable now.
Just a go ahead. So I understand that the underlying trend is maybe a little bit our friend here, but I would just support what's already been said by a couple of regents, which is, feet on the street, recruiters on the ground. I think it's, in my view, would be similar, that they pay for themselves, and we just need to make sure that we're pushing hard.
Okay. Thank you. Student Representative Pathulis, please.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. So, a quick question that I have. So, when you talked about, 25, if you look at the diversity across the first year class, 25% of that is coming from our outside students. And my question is, and I think you talked about this, to look at that sticker price and then know that you would get an aid offer afterwards requires some sort of insight into the application process that I think we can all acknowledge a lot of families, a lot of first-gen families might not have, or students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so I would just like you to address, I know that it's not, 25% is smaller than 75%, but when you're talking about a predominantly white student body, that 25% matters. And so I would just like you to kind of address that and how this would maybe change that for those 25%. But also looking at, so how are we balancing the demographic diversity within that 25% with financial support afterwards, after we make these increases for them? Because are we seeing that these students are leaving at a higher rate than other students after you increase this?
Chair Anderson, Representative Patoulis, I'm not sure I'm following your whole line of questioning perfectly, but I'll try to tackle the last part first. And in particular, you're asking about the 25% that are students of color on our campus, the Twin Cities campus. Well, first generation is 20%, students of color is 24%, Pell eligible is 18%. So each one of those varies somewhat, and there's overlap, of course, among the three. We're very aggressive in terms of need-based packages. So what we provide is for low-income students, and you can't provide a scholarship specifically based on race, ethnicity. Okay, that's against federal law. So what you do is you have packages that are based on need. Okay, so we have Pell, we have state grant, we have the U of M Promise, we have other forms of scholarships. And for a student who is low income, in particular, very low income, zero EFC, we provide about $16,500 in need-based aid, about $2,000 above tuition and fees, and then there's other sources of aid as well. So what I can do is address what we do in terms of need-based aid for low-income students, and then there's all kinds of categories that fit within that. I'm not sure that got specifically to your question or not, but that's basically our strategy.
Thank you. That answer your questions?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we're mindful of that.
Okay, thank you. Regent Hsu. And I'm just going to remind you again, we're going on an hour on this topic, and I think it's very important, so we should talk about it. But if we could be concise, so we've got a couple big items on the agenda, and we'll be here till 3 o'clock. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, presenters. I think it would be helpful if you started earlier in the process in terms of number of applications, in terms of your explanation of where we are. I understand the back half of the story, but I don't understand the beginning half of the story where, we haven't talked about yield rates, we haven't talked about the number of applications, and we haven't talked about some ideas other than kind of the traditional ones. And this is a perfect opportunity for me to discuss test optional, because I think that is one of the things that we could be doing that would help solve some of these problems, including diversity, including NR&R applications, and it would put us in a leadership position in the Big Ten. Instead of being a follower, we could lead on this particular topic, which I think would be important for us. As you know, schools around the country are starting to have been going this way for a number of years. University of Chicago recently, George Washington a few years ago, and I think they've all found that it's been helpful to them. And in terms of our situation and the increasing of tuition, I think most kids who go to school in a high school that have a halfway decent college counseling department understands net pricing and knows how to use a net price calculator, because every school has that on their website. So whether they're applying here or to a private school, they'll figure out, basically what their costs are going to be based on their family situation. So I don't think that's as big a problem. And obviously there are some students in some first generation situations where they're not going to necessarily get that from their family, but they all have friends and they all have counseling departments in their high school. And if they're maintaining good grades and those types of things, their counselors should be helping them get into the best schools they can possibly get into. So I feel like that part of our system is there. That's outside of our system, actually, but I feel like that's there. And I guess the last thing I'll say is just that we do have low enrollment in some colleges. So I don't know how to solve that problem when we have admissions being done centrally, yet we end up with colleges that don't end up getting enough students or could handle more students that they're not getting. So I think that's another place we should be having this discussion. And I'm not sure if that's in the enrollment discussion that's going to come up in a couple more months. But I generally support the 10%. I would go higher, but 10% is fine with me. It gets us to pretty much the middle of the Big Ten. And I'd like to be in the top half, but I'd be happy if we were kind of right there in the middle. So,
thank you, Regent Hsu. I'm not so sure. Good statement. Everything you said was good, but I'm not so sure there's a question for you in there. Did you find one to answer?
You can see a lot of questions, but I'm not sure there's a specific one that you wanted to.
The one that I'd like maybe for you to talk about is the yield rate, the applications and yield rate that we have coming into this year as opposed to previous years. You did mention the Common App might have been a problem, and I do know that a lot of college counselors, especially in the state of Minnesota, like to have the institutional app because they don't have to mess around with all that other stuff, and you can just do one application. If the University of Minnesota is your first choice school, right? Then you don't have to mess around with all the other stuff, and I'm not sure if that might have something to do with the issue last year.
So, Vice Provost McMaster, can you tell us a little about the yield rate?
Chair Anderson and Regent Hsu, I don't have the yield rate tables with me. We have hundreds of yield rates we look at. We look at the yield rates for white students in CFANs. We look at the yield rates for California students in CLA. There's a huge matrix of yield rates that we work with every year to try to calibrate where we are throughout the enrollment season. So that would be another conversation to come in and present the historic and current yield rates. We did bring an extra table here just for your information that shows for the last 5 years in each one of the categories, or the two categories, international and NR&R domestic, the applications, admissions, offers, and enrollment. So in those categories, you can calculate the yield rates from the data here. Back to the Common App and the institutional app, you are absolutely correct that Minnesota residents want an institutional app. They now have an institutional app. It was turned on August 1st. We had students applying to the University of Minnesota on August 1st. And so the whole model will change over this year, because right now 70% of the applications early in the season are coming in through the institutional app, and about 30% are coming in through the Common App, which is about the ratio we'd like to see.
Thank you, Mr. McMaster. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. Regent Powell used the word queasy, and that's what I would like to say about this 10% increase. I am not wedded to the fact that we need to be at the middle of the Big Ten. I think it's more important to think about the geographic realities of our school and the need of the business community to attract talent. We are the only school in the ecosystem, the higher ed ecosystem, that can do that, that can really draw talent from other states, and I think we should pay attention to that. I'm a little distressed that we didn't show the cost of recruiting, the recruiters in the net, and I agree that we're going to have to add recruiters if we want to make these goals. I noticed that the other Big Ten schools last year raised their NRNRs between 2% and 6%, and we're at 15%. We're definitely outliers, and at 10%, I'm pretty sure we'll be an outlier again. Also, California and Illinois are the two that we recruit from the most, and on your map, they're both blue. They're both having the demographic of fewer college-age students. So there are a lot of warning lights out there, and I think we should take a really careful swing at this.
Thank you, Regent Lucas. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a great conversation, and it's nice to hear the extent to which everybody is very in tune and care about, everybody cares about how we perform in this way. I tend to take this with the end in mind, and I look at this as Minnesota's land-grant university and how we operate in serving that role, as all these other institutions, particularly the ones that are charging substantially more than us, are playing that same role in their states. And I'm struck by the fact that we look at these numbers as this fixed point in time, and we say, oh goodness, it looks like we're losing 99 students here. If we were in North Carolina or Florida or Texas or California and on the board of their flagship institution, we'd be absolutely running around with our hair on fire at the low number of Minnesota students that are attending the University of Minnesota. Those are 80, 85, and 90% states for their resident students. We're at 63%. 63% are getting into our land-grant university. Then we start to talk about, what the market does, and I want to go back a little bit to what Regent McMillan talked about as far as looking at, what's the economy. As an economist, what does the market say about this? We know what the market says, because all of those schools that are above us, as other schools that have gone with these very high sticker price models have shown, they're not losing applications. Now, one of the questions then ends up being, well, what's your yield? We have people that are applying. We're not getting a huge yield from students from outside the state. We talk about things like reciprocity with Wisconsin, and Vice Provost McMaster, I think, did a nice job of explaining the fact that everything that's happened on the reciprocity numbers can pretty well be described or explained away by changes in policy, that at one point in time it's less expensive for Wisconsin students to come to the Twin Cities, and they're from western Wisconsin, and then all of a sudden it shifts. Well, they all run back to, if not Madison, Eau Claire, Stevens Point, whatever. So the market is pretty clear as how it impacts some of those modest movements. But I look at this and while I think it's great that we're talking about how do we ensure that we're attracting people from other parts of the nation and of the world, we're also going to have a conversation here in the relatively near future, I expect, where all of us will anguish about how we are not attracting rural students from Minnesota and how they're going to North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa. You know, and at some point in time, we have to take accountability for the fact that there's a natural tension there. If you're filling these seats with students from other parts of the country, you're obviously not going to be spending the resources and having recruiters and so on focusing on attracting Minnesota kids. I spoke with a young woman who's in my children's school district in 30 ACT and just kind of undecided. As a senior, has never been contacted by the University of Minnesota. And so, you know, from a recruitment standpoint, that obviously would be a high payoff target. When we talk about these states, you know, in the investment, I mean, I would love to have more recruiters talking to students in Kenyon or Hibbing or Wilmer or Alexandria, you know, identifying those students that would be interested in coming to Minnesota and are being recruited by states to our west and our south. To ensure that they recognize that this is a great opportunity for them and that we are finding a way of giving them that opportunity. With respect, Regent Lucas made two really significant points. One which leads me to a perspective, and one that I don't know that we're on the same page on. If we're going to build Minnesota's workforce just on simple numbers, let's just get to the objective numbers, we would only admit Minnesota students. Because a Minnesota resident that comes to Minnesota is over 2 out of 3 of those students stays in the state. Non-residents, fewer than 1 in 3. So a Minnesota student is over twice as likely to stay here and work and feed our corporate headquarters and other enterprise in the state. But of course, no one's arguing that we should do that. But I just keep in mind that we're not filling our workforce with recruits from outside of Minnesota. We're meeting other needs that are of value, but we should really be very clear on what those needs are and how that's being served. I do think it's interesting when you think about the dynamic. We are putting recruiters in these states that are blue, as were just described, blue in terms of loss of high school graduates as a percentage. Maybe that's something we should pick up on. Their schools are already high percentage resident state schools, so that's probably to our advantage, but maybe identifying the places where there's a tremendous amount of growth and maybe their higher education systems in those areas aren't quite ready to receive all that growth. And so that would be a more likely opportunity for us to identify students who would maybe not have access to their state school. Bottom line is, I don't think we should be investing so much in trying to replace Minnesota students. And by replace, I really mean prevent them from having access to their land-grant university. I think we should be recruiting them, but I think we should be focusing more on these huge swaths of Minnesota students who have relationships with the legislature, that ultimately will provide us the support to make it affordable for all students, whether they're resident or non-resident. And from that standpoint, again, I'm pleased that we finally have a 3 in front of our number, so that if you're, there's no incoming student that's looking at the number in the right column that shows the percentage increases. They're looking at the other number. And the bottom line is, as we've heard even from student reps that have talked about this, they applied to the most expensive schools in the Big Ten. And when they're admitted, then they start to look at packages and they make decisions about where they're going. So from that standpoint, I think that for our core urban students, for our rural students, I think we have to keep this in perspective. And of course, while this is the shiny object in front of us, we come up with all these ways of how we bolster our NRNR. But I think we're starting at the wrong point. And so from my standpoint, I think 15% would have been a better number. It gets us there in a more appropriate way that signals to the market what the value of an education is here. I'll support the 10% because it is moving us in the right direction. But ultimately, we need to have that broader conversation on what our role is as a land-grant school for this state. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Regent Rocha. Again, a lot of good information there. You did find a question, Vice Provost McMaster. Okay.
Yeah, Chair Anderson and Regent Rocha, members of the committee, this could be a very long conversation. I'll make it quick. Our admissions office is very aggressive in recruitment of Minnesota residents. They're out all over the state at high schools, meeting with counselors, holding sessions, information sessions. So we're not remiss in any way, shape, or form in our attempt to bring in Minnesota students and enroll them. We brought this graph as well. This shows the 64% that you mentioned, where we kind of sit with a number of our peers in terms of residents enrolled. I do want to point out that because of reciprocity, you really have to add 15% onto that number because we treat Wisconsin residents similar to Minnesota residents. So in effect, the real residential number here is 80%, which actually is at the top of this curve. So I think we do well there. We actually admit a very high percent of Minnesota residents. They don't all come here. But again, if we brought back the data showing the admission rates and offers that go to Minnesota residents, Wisconsin residents, California residents, you would see that we're sending out thousands of offers to Minnesota residents. Many of them decide they don't want to come here for good reasons. So, and your comment on blue states is a very good one. Actually, the blue states also have very large populations. So even though they're declining, they still have untapped potential in terms of the number of graduates coming out. A lot of those states that are showing growth are small population states where there's not a lot of potential.
Thank you. Vice Provost McMaster, I'm just going to point out that the 80% you talk about, that's paying in-state tuition, but as Regent Rocha would very easily point out, it's not Minnesota kids.
That's correct.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Mr. Chair, if I can just very briefly. And I appreciate that point. And frankly, if you talk about building workforce, kids from Western Wisconsin, a lot of them end up staying. I think that's a different cohort, and so there is a difference there. I appreciate your comments, and by no means do I want to indicate that the work's not being done. And one of the challenges here is we all talk about the couple students we met on move-in day, or I talked to one student, and then suddenly that becomes the rule. That's not really fair to suggest that that's the case, but sometimes that's our limited data set. So I appreciate that, and I would just congratulate the good people of Illinois and Michigan State for the strong support they're providing to their in-state students. And I do recognize that we are dealing with these things. Obviously, the states that are lower, they've got really big challenges for state funding, and some of them have just got some serious population challenges as well. So eventually we work our way through all this, and there's really almost no data here that can't sort of lead us to where we are. Then the question is just as a matter of policy and in relationship with the state and our mission and so on, we have to get to the right point. I like that we're heading in the right direction. I would just push us a little farther. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got two commentators left, commenters, and we're going to get those very briefly, and then we're going to move on because I know I'm going to be in trouble about 10:45 or 11 o'clock. Student Representative Dean.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Presenters, I just wanted to make a brief comment kind of asking about the percentage of NRNR students who are actually paying NRNR tuition. It would be my assumption that several of our athletes who are on scholarship are recruited from out of state, and that we would also look at people with very high high school and ACT scores. So I'm just wondering if the NRNR students who maybe weren't football stars or maybe didn't get that 35, 36 on the ACT because they couldn't afford to take it multiple times or couldn't get the resources to take those classes ahead of time, if they're paying a higher bill because we're recruiting those truly exceptional athletes or test takers from out of state.
Chair Anderson, Representative Dean, I think that's a somewhat fair assessment that when we recruit when we recruit non-residents, we're really focusing on academic quality. And students, we think, if we're going to make that investment, will come here and succeed here. Because apropos to the recent conversation, we don't want those students leaving. So I don't want to say a bias, but the focus would be on places where we're going to have students who will succeed at the University of Minnesota and graduate in a timely way.
Thank you. Regent Simonson, you're going to take us home on this topic.
Okay, real quick. I would like to, I appreciate what Regent Rocha said and would like to have a longer conversation on that at some time. I think it's important. I appreciate your response to that as well. But just real quickly, tuition and student debt is obviously an issue for many of us. And as I look at, so raising tuition versus raising enrollment. So when I look at page 61 here, Purdue, again, 0, and I believe they froze tuition both in-state and NRNR for a period of time, and their enrollment has gone up. What's the considerations there? And I have one more question after that.
Vice Provost Master.
Chair Anderson and Regent Simonson, I think Associate Vice Provost Tonneson needs to answer some of these questions.
I like you, Bob. You just keep going.
I don't know how to say this delicately, but the academic qualifications of Purdue students are not at the same level as ours. And so they can open the floodgates, but you wouldn't have the same retention rates, you wouldn't have the same graduation rates, and you wouldn't have the same academic quality.
Okay.
Your follow-up, Regent Simonson?
Okay, just real quickly, as far as NRNR, what about graduate and professional schools? Has that changed?
I don't know.
Okay. The President Kaler.
Very quickly, Chair Anderson, Regent Simonson, if the board would like us to have 55% Minnesota residents, we could do a lot with tuition. But the balance we're striving for is between Regent Simonson and Regent Rocha and Minnesota students. We're in the middle, probably a good place. Nobody's particularly happy, but that's where we are. Purdue has 16% international students paying full freight. And if we were able to have 16% of our students paying full freight internationally, we'd be in a different space as we talked about our budget. We've chosen not to do that.
Thank you. It's a lot. It's like being on a teeter-totter, up and down. And Vice Provost McMaster, thank you for all of your answering of our questions. I am going to comment that you do get to leave, and I think Associate Vice President Tonneson is still going to be there to answer some questions. So thank you, and we are going to introduce the next topic, which is the 2020 budget variables and levers, and it's just a discussion for us to learn about it. We're going to have a hard stop at 10:05 so we can continue on with everything else we have. I think we've got about 5 or 10 minutes of preliminaries, and we'll be able to ask questions. So I think, is President Kaler, do you want to introduce a topic, or do we go right to Senior Vice President Burnett?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. No, I do want to really encourage a robust discussion of these variables and levers. This is part of our continuing evolution over years of trying to bring timely, appropriate information about the budget to the board in a schedule that you can influence and not bring you a fully baked budget in May and vote yes or no. So this is a great opportunity for you to hear about the levers we have. We've just talked about one of them extensively, but I will turn it over to Senior Vice President for Operations and Finance and his very able assistant, Associate Vice President of University Finance, Julie Thomas.
Thank you. Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. There's two purposes for today's presentation. Primary purpose is to tee up the resource and expenditure variables that we need to discuss for the development of the FY20 budget. We're hoping this is an opportunity for the board members to identify priorities and issues that you'd like to see addressed in the budget in the next year. And the second purpose that we just talked about extensively is bring forward the President's recommendation on NR&R tuition for review by the board at this meeting. We'll discuss this near the end of the presentation. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Associate Vice President Tonneson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Burnett. Ms. Tonneson?
Mr. Chair, members, I'll run through this slide really fast. This is just an attempt to give us some context in how your schedule allows for us to discuss the budget variables during the year. We began that in September with the biennial budget request and some of the impact on FY20. We're here today to talk about really high 30,000-foot budget variables that we've discussed in the past, but just to remind folks of what those are and how we approach them in the budget. In December, we will talk through the long-range financial planning update And then we're back in February to talk about the variables again, perhaps with a little bit more specificity in terms of actual values and opportunities for FY20. And then this year, because it's a biennial budget year, you will see the President's recommended FY20 operating budget for review and approval both in June at 2 separate meetings in June. Oh, sorry, I forgot I had a little animation in there on the arrows. But before we talk about the variables, we wanted to reground everybody in what the budget actually is and how we think about it.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, just a reminder, this pie chart depicts the color of money for many of our revenues, and some are more fungible than others, as we've discussed with you previously. Of the $3.9 billion in revenue included in our annual budget, $1.6 billion is made up of tuition and state support, and that represents about 41% of the total in this pie chart, or the dark green slice. It is the focus of this budget framework discussion because this is where the decisions can be made. The remaining slices represent other unrestricted revenues that come into the institution, auxiliaries at 10% in the yellow, and restricted and sponsored revenues in the red at 35% of the institution. Over the past several decades, there has been a dramatic and permanent reset of the university's revenues. Over this time period, as a share of the total, state appropriations have declined from 39% of the resource base to 17%. Tuition has increased from 12 to 23% of the resource base, and all other revenues, if you look at this chart, have increased from 49% to 60%. So I submit to you, as I've said to you before, this university's worked hard at diversifying its revenue base over this time horizon as this other phenomenon that was taking place here at the University of Minnesota and every other public university in the United States, where we change the proportion of how much is state-supported versus student-supported, is reset.
So I want to spend a few minutes on the next few slides kind of hitting home one particular concept in the budget that is sometimes lost on audiences but is important for you as decision makers, and that is thinking through how these funding sources are actually considered in the budget planning process. It is the tuition and the O&M funds, that 41% of our revenues just mentioned, that's available to cover the basic operating costs of delivering on our mission. They are unrestricted and discretionary and available at the institutional level for kind of setting the stage. As a result, the budget discussion before you each year focuses largely on those revenue funds. The other revenues are included in the budget as well, but in a different way. We monitor them, we estimate them, we discuss them with the units that generate them. Remember, they are generated differentially and are available differentially across the institution. Some units have those other funds, some units do not. The general assumption in those other funds is that the growth in revenues will cover any required cost increases associated with those activities, and if that revenue growth is inadequate, one of two things has to happen. Either the expenditures need to be reduced to match those revenues, or the unit and or the institution have to decide to divert other unrestricted, perhaps O&M funding, into those activities to cover costs. On the flip side, if those revenues are growing faster than their associated costs, there are times, if they are unrestricted, that expenditures currently in O&M can move into those other funds. At the institutional level for the current year, just over $2.1 billion will be generated across those, quote, other sources outside of O&M and tuition. For each unit, we review the status of their revenues across all these sources you see here, looking at recent actual information as well as a forecast for the current year and the next budget year. As mentioned previously today and on other occasions, some of these are highly restricted and can't be moved to address challenges throughout the institution. Sponsored grants, contracts, federal appropriations, gift and endowment earnings, private practice funds are all in that restricted group. Auxiliary funds, as Senior Vice President Burnett just mentioned, are from sales to individuals or the public. Those are generally by design set to cover their costs in addition to some overhead, but they are also not available for discretionary use throughout the institution. That leaves ICR and the sales fees and miscellaneous income as unrestricted. These, as I mentioned, are differentially generated across the institution. Within most of the bars you see here, there are actually different types of revenue, so we offer one example. Within the sales fees and miscellaneous income category, which is highlighted here in gold, one of the types of revenue included within that is royalty income. The average annual royalty revenue over the last 5 years is roughly in the $18 to $20 million range on a recurring basis. Once in a while, there's a large one-time infusion of funds from a sale or a settlement, but the recurring level is in that $18 to $20 million range. By policy, it is distributed 1/3 to the inventor, 1/3 to the college or the department, and 1/3 to the vice president for research. That 1/3 to the inventor leaves the institution. It's not available to us. The 1/3 to the college or department is unrestricted for that college and department and does cover general operating expenses, but sometimes they consider it non-recurring because at that level, it's pretty volatile. It comes in, it doesn't maintain for years. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The vice president for research third, however, is more stable. That amount is available, and you can think about that as perhaps an offset to O&M expenses. It helps the general operating funds of the Vice President for Research. But that roughly $3 to $5 million annually that goes for that purpose is 0.001 of our revenues. It's a very small portion of our revenue. And even if you had a 20% sustained growth, which would be huge in any revenue source, if you could grow a revenue source 20%, that still is only 0.0003 of our revenues. It's important for its purpose. It's very important, and we try to maximize it, but it does not help us address the large costs that exist across the O&M and tuition part of the budget. And because that same similar scenario plays out for the rest of those other funds, in that category, we can rely on them only on the margin to provide opportunities for investment or solve problems. That's why it falls largely to O&M tuition to handle the basic operating costs for our mission. And for planning purposes in the budget, we use a tool called the budget framework. And you've heard about this in the past, but it identifies at the 30,000 foot the assumptions we're going to make about incremental changes in revenues and costs. It includes answers to questions like, what do we know or estimate about changes in the state appropriation, in tuition, in reallocation? On the cost side, we talk about what are we going to pay for compensation, for program investments, for facility costs, and other operations. And as a tool, it has to balance every year. Those incremental changes in our process have to balance. So in the past, it has been helpful to provide you with a little trend information on those framework variables, and we'll start quickly with the resource side. Oops. We've been discussing the biennial budget request of the state of Minnesota, and we have reviewed this particular trend chart in various formats at different times. In the most recent past, since the newest low point in our appropriation in FY12 of $570 million, the appropriation has actually grown 18%, since that time. Of the 5 years with positive growth in that time frame, the average annual increase has been 3 to 4%. As we presented earlier today, we're asking for a biennial increase of 6.7%. That actually translates back to a 4.5% annual increase. All right. So for early budget planning, we would generally base our models on what we're requesting and then build contingency scenarios at lower levels of funding. A second resource in the budget framework is internal reallocation, because as we make decisions to reduce spending in one area, that frees up a resource to spend on a higher priority, assuming the revenue isn't going down. So each year, the framework includes reallocations to help balance the budget, and they've generally been in the 1 to 3% range. Over the last 8 years, a majority of these reallocations have been implemented as reductions to administrative expense and to positions, but a number of reductions have involved cuts to mission activities as well, because we've needed to do that to address costs. The reallocations have varied, as you can see, from a low of 0.3% in FY13 to a high of 3% in FY12 when we faced significant drops in our appropriation. As we move beyond the $90 million goal, we recognize that this tool must remain in our budget balancing plans, but it could take a different direction as we learn about the various ways we can improve efficiencies, work smarter, and actually focus on priorities. And the third primary revenue within the framework is tuition. Prior to President Kaler's arrival and during some period of significant appropriation reductions from the state, the average annual growth in tuition revenue this century was $50 million. Over the last 8 years, we've worked hard and with the help of the state to bend that curve. The average annual growth has dropped to $22 million. And that includes not just rate changes, that includes all enrollment changes and from all levels of students. Okay, that's a revenue picture. The primary focus of holding tuition rate increases down has been in the resident undergraduate category, and you have seen this chart in the past. Across all campuses since FY13, the tuition rate increase has either been non-existent or very modest. It has been on an average annual basis less than the rate of inflation at 1.2% for the Twin Cities campus and less than 0.5% at our system campuses. In just a few moments, we'll circle back to talk about the proposal to increase the undergraduate non-resident non-reciprocity rate on the Twin Cities campus, but potential changes in any of the other rates must also be discussed throughout the remainder of the budget planning cycle. Moving to a brief discussion on the cost. First and foremost, we have the cost of compensation. It is our largest expenditure category as we are largely a people place. In the FY10 through FY12 years, we implemented 2 salary freezes, 1 delayed increase partway into the year, and 1 required furlough period. After those years, we've implemented general increases in the compensation budget of either 2 or 2.5%. Just as with tuition, there's a number of variables we take into consideration before landing on a planning estimate, but it is an extremely important part of our budget, as you are aware.
And to that point, to Associate Vice President Tonnison's point, I would just suggest to you again that the greatest resource of this university is our people. It's our faculty, it's our staff that deliver on the mission every day. It's the programs that we are able to mount that bring the students here to come to school. So we have an obligation, in my opinion, to make sure they feel valued and are compensated in a competitive and meaningful way. And Julie will walk us through these factors as we consider and budget for a merit increase pool in the upcoming budget year.
Yeah, so to just spend a couple of minutes on this one, because it is a major aspect of our budget. Each year, the budget includes an estimated cost for delivering an overall increase in the salary pool of a certain percent, plus the added cost of the employer portion of fringe benefits. The decision to increase that overall salary pool by a specific percent is largely based on 3 considerations. First, what is happening inside the organizations with which we compete for talent? What increases are being planned for Twin Cities industry and across other higher education institutions? Second, what is happening with the cost of living for our employees? What do we need to do to keep them even or deliver gains in terms of buying power? And third, what is happening with other costs within the university and the revenues available to address them? In other words, what else is potentially constraining this spending? In the end, it is a balancing act between those factors and those different forces that leads us to a decision on what to include in the budget. Once we decide on that increase for the general merit pool, the decisions on what increases to grant individual employees falls to the units throughout the university, working within the general pool increase planned for in the budget. So as an example, if we're planning a 2.5% increase, if I'm a manager, I'm going to calculate what does a 2.5% increase cost for every one of my employees? If I was going to give everyone 2.5, what does that cost? And then as a manager, I would determine individual increases for my people based on performance. Decisions are made in this example to give some employees less than the 2.5% increase so that funds are available to give other employees more than a 2.5% increase. The constraint is to keep the total cost increase within the dollars budgeted for compensation. In addition to that, in some cases, units have individual employees or employee groups that are currently being paid below the market for their skills, which often leads to high turnover and difficulty in finding qualified people, so positions are held open longer than they should be, both of which contribute to lower productivity. In this small number of cases each year, the cost to make a market adjustment for employees becomes an investment decision in the budget, either through additional internal reallocation or deliberate decision to invest increased resources. Those types of increases are often made over and above the general merit pool. So both increases are built into the budget, just in different ways. For the budget framework, it is the first category, the merit pool, the overall pool that is referenced as the compensation cost because it is applied to all units across the institution. Finally, we can generally categorize our non-personnel expenses for framework planning purposes into 3 groups. Facilities, which will vary each year depending on things like the weather and our earlier decisions to reduce or expand, our total square footage, those kinds of things. Second category is operations, which often focuses largely on increasing technology costs for our core enterprise systems, the library systems, other academic systems, and so forth. Sometimes these are driven by programmatic choices we make. Other times they're driven by external vendor contracts and agreements for licensing and maintenance. And then finally, we have a category of strategic choices, which involves a whole range of opportunities and obligations we face as each unit needs to be successful as possible in achieving its goals and thus in fulfilling the mission of the university. This is the category where things we've talked about today, like the recruiters, if we're going to hire additional recruiters, they would fall in here. If we're going to make market compensation adjustments for an individual or a group of individuals, this is where that would fall. Those are today examples of what would fall in that category. Before turning to a discussion about all of these variables, as mentioned in the previous presentation, we've chosen to bring forward the one specific budget recommendation now for your review.
So as we discussed earlier, the President is recommending for your consideration a 10% Twin Cities NR tuition rate increase for the next fiscal year. The charts in the previous presentation indicated our place in the Big Ten currently and how this percentage increase places us closer to the median. Julie will walk through these slides very briefly so we can begin this discussion, but this would be for review today and discussion today. And again, I support what Vice Provost McMaster indicated to the board, that the known is better than the unknown when we continue to work on building these pipelines of NR students to supplement the Minnesota students and the reciprocity students that come to the university.
Sorry. As you recall from earlier this morning, we did model a number of scenarios for different NR tuition rate increases. Associated with the President's recommendation at 10% for the entering class, as you see in the gold colored column here, we would be including a projected net revenue gain of $6.8 million in the budget. That is after building in the projected drop in the NR enrollment of 60 students that we showed you, and a $1 million increase in the waivers offered to prospective students. Again, with this recommendation, continuing students would see no more than a 5.5% rate increase. The recommendation is offered at this time, as we've mentioned, rather than in June, not because it is based on generating a certain dollar amount to balance the budget, but because it is based on a strategy to adjust our price. And also because admissions advises that having the information is helpful in recruiting. The strategy comes first, and the resulting revenue increase would then be built into our framework for the remainder of budget planning. And with that, Mr. Chair, we look forward to the committee's discussion on all these high-level variables we put before you today, and we have summarized here on this slide.
Thank you, Vice President Tonneson. That's and Senior Vice President Burnett, a very good presentation. I think it, again, I learn things slower, but after my 3 years here, I've kind of figured out that where us around this table have a chance to do something is trying to raise revenue, is to try to get, well, there are other things that do happen. It's mostly about trying to get increased appropriations and then what we can do with tuition. And the rest kind of comes and goes, but it is not a big part of that discussion. So with that, I want to open this up for any questions on anybody has about our framework for the budget. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. This is a specific kind of question, but it's one that rattles around in my brain. When we raise NR 10%, the athletic budget goes up for scholarships, right? Because they have to pay more for their outstate students. And does that then get reflected in the athletic budget, or is that just something pushed to the side? I'm not sure how significant it is.
There is an impact to our intercollegiate athletics for the students they recruit from non-reciprocity states or outside Minnesota. That does become a burden to their and a cost increase to the athletic budget. That's absolutely correct.
But that budget is off to the side. That's their problem.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Regent Lucas, if you recall, within that budget we brought in July with Athletic Director Coyle, they have a number of revenue sources, tickets, donations, those. They have to manage that within there because they have to pay that tuition rate. We do have, as we disclosed back in July, there is a $1 million, but that million keeps getting eaten up as we raise this. So yes, there's an impact to the athletic budget that they have to budget moving forward if this goes forward.
So one of the risks that we keep talking about in audit committee are the fact that ticket sales are down, Big Ten revenue, media may or may not go down. So it adds to a problem somewhere else. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, it definitely presents a challenge to athletics. That is one of the unintended consequences for sure.
Thank you. Regent Paul.
Thanks. Thank you, Chair. A question and a comment, and the question is for Associate Vice President Tonneson. You didn't mention, I appreciate the discussion on compensation and the depth that you went into, and I also appreciate the general sort of national framework around higher ed, where we're all sort of challenged by demographics, basically. I mean, it's the increase in state budgets devoted to health care and pensions and that sort of thing, and that is a challenge across the country that all of us face, and it's just there. And so I appreciate the way you frame that. One point, you didn't comment on the fringe part of this year's budget, and that can be a wild card, so I'd appreciate maybe a few comments on that and where you see that going and opportunities there. And then just the second comment is, I think in either it was stated or was in the narrative talked about, it's either tuition revenue or it's state funding. I mean, those are the two levers. And I think someone said earlier, I think it's really important from my point of view that we acknowledge that those aren't the only two levers. And I think so you shouldn't frame it that way. A third critical lever, and I hope that you include this, as we continue to work our way through the budget, a third lever is our own search for, process improvement, efficiency, productivity, whatever you want to call it. And sometimes we call it reallocation, but I think that really is a crucial variable, and it's one that we control, given that we face this demographic situation that is not going to allow us to count on big increases in state funding. We just have to go to that process bucket in new and creative and innovative ways, or we're never going to be able to solve these equations. So I'd urge you to include that as a component, and I think we need to get deeper and show more depth and breadth in how we're pursuing that. I mean, as you know, we've talked about this offline several times. I think there's an awful lot of opportunity there. The
Any comment to that?
Mr. Chair, Regent Powell, I hope I didn't leave you with the impression that we don't feel that the process redesign and the efficiencies is important. That is clearly reflected in our language. That's reflected in the reallocation resource in the budget, clearly equal to the appropriation and tuition. It is part of every budget we've done pretty much every year, and we will continue to do that. And I try to make the point that as we're moving beyond the 90 million, there are new ways to look at that and that goal and that tool in our toolbox, and that is clearly on the table. In terms of your fringe question, just a real quick comment on that. We have calculated that even with no salary increase in the O&M and tuition funds, which is roughly 55% of our total compensation costs, it will add an additional $11 million next year, even if we didn't give a raise. But because of the way the fringe process works, every 1% salary increase is another $11 million on top of that. So we clearly are planning for that and know that is there. That is being driven largely by because of the methodology. It's largely by healthcare costs that are increases that occurred from 17 to 18, and we're now catching up for that. Vice President Burnett could speak more, and Vice President Kathy Brown could also speak more in terms of the benefit programs we offer our students and the ways that that can be adjusted into the future. But that isn't part of what we're developing right now.
Quick follow-on,
I
Chair.
appreciate your comment there too. Just one moment. I think maybe Regent Powell might have been talking about myself when I said the revenue places we can get it is from appropriations. And I certainly understand efficiency. I certainly see that too, the readjustments. So I didn't mean to insinuate that we can't get efficiencies. You have a follow-up?
Yeah, just a quick, so just for sake of argument, and I know we're early in the process, but let's say that we started to gravitate towards a 2% salary increase, and I'm not really advocating for that one, but if that were where we landed, I mean, I think the math, and then with fringe, I mean, that's $50 million.
Mr. Chair, Regent Powell, across all funds, yes. In the O&M and tuition funds, it would be around $30 to $32 million. Yes.
Plus the fringe.
No, that would include fringe.
Okay, thank you.
That would include fringe.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chair and Regent Powell, part of the reason the fringe is going up is the methodology the federal government makes us do, because we have to apply fringe across all funding sources because we're such a heavily research-based institution. And we had a refund a few years ago in a pharmaceutical piece of our benefit plan that's working its way out. And so we just had to, so we were artificially low on fringe for a while. We took advantage of that in the budget process, and now it's coming back up without that refund.
And the healthcare costs are growing.
Right. Thank you. Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very, very quickly, there's a lot of good stuff here. Two observations very quick. One is we talk about the market adjustment pool. What will be helpful and what I'm hoping we can get at as we go forward is, you talk about areas where the market has changed and we're now below. My expectation is there are probably areas where we might be a little strong. And so to the extent we can actually maybe have kind of a comprehensive look at all areas, I think that's helpful. The last comment is when it comes to this, I find that when we talk about personnel and compensation, I really think that we have such a varied group, whether you're starting at senior administration on down to people who are part-time lab staff. Breaking that out more specifically certainly is helpful to me. That along with how we're approaching our tuition and our admissions, particularly as it relates to Minnesota students, those two things will have a lot to say about whether we continue to be a strongly supported institution from state appropriation standpoint. In the shadow of this discussion about our biennial budget, this is sort of timely, that if we're mindful of our ability to be, to demonstrate accountability in that respect, and also are demonstrating that we have a commitment to serving the students that legislators will be particularly fond of, I think will help us in that regard, and keep us from having to go to the other models that we see where the states aren't providing nearly as much support and they're having to rely on non-resident and high tuition. So to the extent we can kind of break that out going forward, that'd be helpful for me.
Mr. Chairman.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regent Rocha, we do plan at the February Finance and Operations Committee, we've heard that request from board members, and we plan on digging in on that piece before we get into the and getting you more granularity and more detail on that. Because there are some areas, I will tell you, where we are under market and losing employees in some critical areas like the vet diagnostic lab. Dean Ames and I have been talking about challenges he's having in keeping staff that have to work 7/24 to respond to industry crises over the weekends and on holidays. I think we need to pay attention to that. So it isn't a one-size-fits-all, but I do think there are some pockets where we've got challenges that we need to address. And so we'll highlight some of those for you, but in fairness, we'll look at where we're above market, but I think we'll bring you those in February. That will be our to bring.
It's something that would be good for all of us to see.
Absolutely.
Both sides.
Yeah,
both
we've
sides.
heard that.
Thank you. Thank you. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and presenters. February, we're going to be talking about operational excellence as an update. I encourage us to, as we talk about cost savings and such, to think in terms of a program, an approach, and that's one we took on 6 years ago. We set a goal, we defined what it was we were going to do, and we've met it. Now we're going to have a new president by next summer. We need to prioritize this part of the conversation and lay out some options for how we can look at it with a new, fresh, new set of eyes. I would just encourage us further, though, be talking about investment at the same time we're talking about cost savings, because the amount of time we spend talking about cost reductions and savings compared to the amount of time that we talk about investments is really out of balance, in my opinion. We used to talk a lot about being a top 3 public research institution, really part of my administration of my service. And we've been subsumed in the cost side and the pressures that have been laid on us by the economy. And I just think we're losing track of that and what it would take to increase our standing 1 or 2 positions. The new agreement with Fairview is going to open doors for us, new-found money. And what's that going to do? And we know we're going to deploy it into research. But so my point is, same time we're talking about cost savings, and we got to relook at it. It's got to start. We got to turn the clock back, and with a new president, new paradigm under a program. At the same time, talk about excellence, as President Kaler said, not lose track of that, not have that just become a footnote. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Next, we've got Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Not losing sight of excellence and what we want to be, this institution to be. 2 comments, or 1 comment, 1 question, if I could, Julie. The first comment is regard to undergrad tuition. And I know when we make charts, we always make charts to start at certain days chronologically to either show a story we want to show or not show a story we don't want to show, depending upon where we start a chart chronologically. And as I say that, I want to compliment President Kaler very, very sincerely, because I think in the last 6 years, he has done a wonderful job with the help of you folks to reallocate funds to priorities, to true missions, and certainly to hold tuition to a moderate increase. However, if our chart would have started a little bit earlier, say in the year 2001, and did just a little minimal research, our tuition increases would have not been much more than modest. In fact, about 300%, pretty close to about 300%. I think our tuition in 2001 was about middle 4,500, someplace in there. So we'd have been looking at a very, very significant increase on the tuition of our students. Now, some may be due to the economy, 2001, September 11th, less state appropriation, whatever, but rather significant, 300% or in that area. That's just my comment. My question is, in regards to the expenses and the compensation, I know that we have merit increases, and last year we looked at about a 2% increase across the board, depending upon merit, performance. Can you tell me how many of our 26,000 employees, or approximately 26,000 plus, did receive less than a 2% increase?
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Mr. Chairman, Regent Swigum, I don't have that information with me. We'll get that for you. I can tell you in my unit, there were people who didn't get a 2%. So I know they exist because I have the responsibility to manage in my unit as well. And so they're there. We can get you the numbers. I don't have that with me here today.
I'd like to see that, because I know the trend is that everybody gets 2%, and it's tough to give somebody less than that, but I'd just like to see it. Was that 1,000 people? Was it 100? Was it 15,000 that didn't receive the 2%?
And it'll vary by where we have discretion, right? Regent Anderson, Regent Swigum, for the bargaining classes, we don't have that luxury. So for those that are covered by, and we have a number of union contracts, including 2 in front of you here today, that isn't the case. But when you think about faculty and P&A staff, that is the direction from the president, from the provost, and myself to this entire institution, that any increases for where we can have discretion are placed in a merit-based way, not across the board. And so we'll get that data for you, sir.
Thank you, Regent Swigum. I think that's the last questioner on that. You guys have done a terrific job answering them. The board did a great job on catching up on time. I feel like I can almost take a breath now. I guess next we're going to call Vice President Kathy Brown and Senior Director Patty Dillon up to the podium, and we are going to talk about some of those places we don't have discretion once we reach agreements. We're going to have 2 collective bargaining agreements that we hope to approve today. Vice President Brown, would you want to, or Senior Director Dion, would you want to lead us through the first one, which I believe is the law enforcement labor services?
Chair Anderson, members of the committee, first and foremost, in regard to both of these contracts, I always want to thank our employees and their representatives for the very respectful negotiation processes that we have. We work long and hard with those groups, and we want to recognize that they work long and hard as well, and in a very respectful way. And with that, I'll turn it on to Senior Director Dion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. We are pleased to bring for your approval today 2 labor agreements. This first one is an agreement between the university and the Law Enforcement Labor Services, shorthand for LELS. This union represents 55 police officers on the Twin Cities campus, the Morris, and the Duluth campuses. This is a 2-year agreement between January 2018 and December 2019. This is an agreement with a new union. The police officers have elected LELS to replace the Minnesota Public Employee Association. This agreement provides for a 2.93 pay adjustment to all employees in the first year of the contract. This adjustment was necessary to keep us competitive with other metropolitan jurisdictions in order to recruit and retain police officers. In the second year of the contract, employees will receive a 2% wage adjustment and a one-time lump sum payment of 1%. Police officers will also receive an increase of $23 to their uniform allowance. This is again to be competitive with the market. In summary, we have a good working relationship with this union. With our police officers, it was a successful negotiation, and this tentative agreement has been ratified by the police officers.
Thank you. I guess I'd like to get a motion to approve this on the floor, and then we can have discussion if we do.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with the Law Enforcement Labor Services. Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman.
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. If we were to compare a beginning police officer at the University of Minnesota and say Minneapolis or St. Paul, how much difference is there in the beginning salary, or is that not our competition? Is it suburbs, or it's county deputies, or is it state patrol? Can you give a little picture of that?
Presenters, do you have that information?
I don't have the actual numbers in front of me, but I can tell you that no, the cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis are not the market that we compare with. We have a series of suburban cities that we look at that are comparable to us in terms of the size of our police officer and the population.
Thank you. Does that answer your question? Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, follow up. So what is the full range of a police officer at the University of Minnesota, starting to 30 years of experience? What's the salary range?
I'm sorry, I don't have the figure exactly in front of me. I can tell you that people start at the starting wage. It takes them 5 years to get to the maximum of the salary range.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions on this agreement? If not, I'll ask all those in favor of the agreement with the Law Enforcement Labor Services Union signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. So we have our same presenters for the collective bargaining agreement with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 292. And if you would give us information on that, please.
Thank you. The second contract is with our broadcast technicians who are represented, as you indicated, by the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. This is our smallest unit at the university. We have 2 employees in this unit. One employee works on the Duluth campus and supports the technical equipment in the radio station, and the other employee works on the Twin Cities in classroom management, and he supports the technical equipment that exists in classrooms and some meeting rooms that are used for video conferencing. This is a 3-year contract from June 2018 to June 2021. In the first year of the contract, employees will receive a 2% wage adjustment, In the second and third year of the contract, employees will receive the same percentage increase pool as established for our civil service employees. Those have not been established yet. This tentative agreement has been approved by the members, and we ask for your approval of this agreement. Thank you.
All right, before we discuss it, is there someone who would make a motion for approval of the international?
So moved.
So moved, it's been seconded. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, Regents, this is really a dumb question. Why would any individual want to be a member of a union and only have one other person? Why wouldn't you align yourself with someone else? And I'm not trying to be disrespectful, it just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Chair Anderson, Regent Johnson, this unit has not always been that small. We had several dozen people in this unit when it was first chosen by the members, but over time, as the function has changed, it has become smaller and smaller. I once asked the commissioner of the Bureau of Mediation Services what was the smallest number of employees could you have in a union, and his answer was one.
Thank you. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you, presenters. I was just curious, so one of these employees works for our Duluth radio station. Who supports our Twin Cities radio station if they're not in the union?
I think, Chair Anderson,
please, yeah.
Regent Hsu, I think that's primarily run by students and student employees.
I see, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm now going to ask for a vote to approve the bargaining agreement for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 292. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, presenters.
Thank you.
We're going to now call, I think, Vice Chancellor Quito and Mr. Partridge, the University Architect, is here. The next item on our agenda, while they're coming up, I'll just mention it. It's the capital budget amendment for the ice rink refrigerant and the HVAC replacement at the Sports and Health Center in Duluth. If you remember last month, we had review on this. We had I think a letter from Duluth students, how they can't wait to get this completed because it's a big part of their, I guess, intramural and recreational sports functions up there. And I don't know if you have anything to present. Maybe we should ask for the motion first, and then we can, if the people have questions, we'll ask that.
Sounds good.
It's been moved. Second? Regent Lucas seconds. It's been moved and seconded that we approve the capital budget amendment for the ice rink refrigerant and the HVAC replacement for the Sports and Health Center on the Duluth campus. Is there any discussion or any questions of our, are you Mr. Partridge?
I am, sorry.
Okay, you're the
Yes.
architect, okay. So any questions of Mr.
Yes,
Partridge?
happy to answer any.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Partridge?
Yes.
Yes. Although you haven't presented anything yet, I hope you'll answer my question. If we approve this today, when would we likely see this project completed?
The project would be completed in summer of next year, July 2019.
Thank you. Okay. Any other questions? If not, all those in favor of this capital budget amendment for the ice rink refrigerant and HVAC replacement for the Sports and Health Center on Duluth signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Partridge. We next have a review of a real estate transaction out in Oregon. I believe it's property owned by the Arboretum that believes they have no more use for some property out in Oregon and would just soon like to cash it in. So this is Ms. Kruger, Assistant Vice President Kruger. I'm going to ask you to lead us through this, if you will.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. The property that is in question is 24 17/100 acres in Aurora, Oregon. It's improved with 3 buildings, 2,760 square feet. And this property was donated to the university from the Landscape Plant Development Center in 2013. The Landscape Plant Development Center was a Minnesota nonprofit company formed by one of our former professors in what is now CFANS. He completed his research. He then donated it to the university for the purpose of continuing research by the Landscape Arboretum to consider what the interplay between climates in terms of Oregon's more temperate climate compared to Minnesota's, and what that does in terms of plant research. The Landscape Arboretum, as Chair Anderson noted, no longer has a use for this property and would like to, given the fact that it's in Oregon, it's a little bit of a commute, so wants to dispose of the property. So the transaction that is before you today is to sell the property to Mr. Brock Ludlow for $515,000. That is a full price offer. We would like to close on or before December 28th. Our buyer is very interested in closing prior to that. The university will retain some of the intellectual property and equipment that will be shipped back to the Arboretum. And we still have yet to, we have a title defect to resolve related to the original donation to the Landscape Plant Development Center prior to our acquisition involving Oregon State University Foundation. And so our current negotiations with Oregon State University Foundation will require us to pay $100,000 of the $515,000 to their foundation to resolve that title defect. We also will pay a 6% brokerage fee at closing.
Okay, thank you. So we have some costs associated coming out of the proceeds.
That is correct.
Okay. Again, this is for review, so I'm not going to ask for any motion, but is there discussion or questions we want to ask Vice President Kruger? Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would there be any advantage to having action on this item sooner?
The buyer is interested in moving forward, and so if there are no questions, we would greatly appreciate action on that today.
Mr. Chair, my understanding, at least from our previous discussion, is that with unanimity, we can move it from review to action, and so I would so move, provided the full board is in agreement.
We need a second first, and we can discuss
Second.
it. It's been moved and seconded. That's exactly the way we should move some of these things, and if is there any? So it's been moved and seconded. Regent Powell.
Thanks, Chairman. Just one more quick question. Do we know the intended use by the buyer? I mean, is this really in a very rural location? Is it farmland? Or I'm just curious about how we think the land is likely to be used.
It is in an agricultural area. It's in the Willamette Valley, and I told people that I'd be more than happy to have to go out to the Willamette Valley to sign the closing documents, but I've been assured that we can do that remotely. The buyer intends to, as far as we know, use it for agricultural purposes.
Regent Hsu, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. AVP Kruger, maybe you're not the right person to answer this question, but where do the funds go after the net funds, I guess?
Senior Vice President Burnett, do you have an answer to that?
I think Assistant Vice President Kruger can as well, but I believe the donation was to the Landscape Arboretum, so any net proceeds after solving the title issue and the commission would go to the funds for the purpose to the Landscape Arboretum. Is that correct?
That is correct. Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, per university policy, that if it was part of a gift that we're then disposing of, it does go back to the recipient unit of that gift. But in other cases where it's not part of a gift, then it goes into the university's acquisition account for future acquisition of property.
Regent McMillan.
Regent Hsu covered my question. I pass.
Okay. My question is, does the donor know that we are planning to sell it?
Yes.
And they're fine with that?
Regent, Chair Anderson, yes, the conversations that have been occurring particularly related to the Oregon State Foundation all pertain to the original donation and the issues related to that.
So we have no ill will towards the University of Minnesota for trying to turn it into cash?
That is my understanding, but I would defer to our attorney, Beth Zamzow, if she has any other additional information on that.
I'm just thinking of public relations. But, okay. If you'd please identify yourself and give us an answer, please.
Yes, Chair Anderson,
I'm Beth Samso, attorney at the Office of the General Counsel, and I don't have any additional information. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's been moved and it's seconded and it's on the floor and we've had discussion, so we are going to take a vote on moving forward with the real estate transaction of the Aurora, Oregon Research Station. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, we're now to the consent report. And consent report, from what I have in my notes, it's report version 2, which at least Regents have printed copies of. It includes a Central Reserves contingency allocation for the presidential search, purchase of goods and services of $1 million and over, a resolution related to the settlement of the Cook, I'll call it, Department of Health Services arbitration, an employment agreement for the Vice President of Research, and an amended employment agreement for the Director of Athletics, Twin Cities Campus. President Kaler, would you like to comment on the employment agreements?
Thank you, Regent Anderson. I'll do Vice President for Research first. This was an internal search. We have fantastic leadership capacity in this space at the university, and with the presidential transition occurring, that felt the right thing to do to me. The search committee was chaired by CSE Dean Moscave. We contacted each person that was nominated, worked through the summer, and recommended one finalist to me. In light of the transition in the president's position, it felt appropriate to me, in conversation with the vice chair of the board, that we make this a term appointment. So it's a 2-year term contract. It is important to have a person in place here, not in an interim position, in order to fill some additional leadership spots in the Office of the Vice President for Research, and to be a steady hand as we continue to transition some of the academic health center responsibilities into OVPR. So this also provides some certainty for Vice President Kramer, who I have appointed to this position pending your approval, in the sense that should the new president want to go in another direction, it's a good time frame for him to, or her, to make that evaluation and move forward. So all in all, I think this is a good outcome. Vice President Kramer is a remarkable individual. His details are in your portfolio. He is a very active researcher in our chemistry department. Has served as the associate dean in the College of Science and Engineering. Has a very good research portfolio and an understanding of what needs to be done. I have put him at a salary of $325,000, which is between the 25th and 50th percentile of our comparison group of vice presidents for research. So with that, I would respond to questions or simply ask your approval.
Okay, and it is on a consent report, so at this point, we plan to approve it all at once unless someone wants to break it out, but let's ask questions first. Regent Johnson.
Thank you. Mr. President, Dr. Kramer, upon his completion of his supposedly new responsibilities and tasks, is he eligible, if he were replaced with someone else, is he eligible to come back to the faculty in his previous position? It may be in this memo and I didn't see it.
Chair Anderson, Regent Johnson, absolutely. He will retain his tenured faculty position in the chemistry department, maintain advisement of some students and momentum for his research activities on a personal level. So should this not be a permanent position for him, he can resume his research capacities. That's the plan.
Thank you.
And the other employment agreement, President Kaler.
Thank you. I have also, with your approval, extended the employment agreement of the athletic director, Mark Coyle, for 3 additional years. This is a significantly important thing to do, I believe, as we move through this transition. Mark Coyle has done simply a fantastic job as athletic director here. I, in my role in the Big Ten and in the NCAA, have come in contact with many athletic directors across the country and seen many athletic programs. And a person of Mark Coyle's integrity, his accomplishments, his ability to attract and retain talent, and the overall movement of the athletic department forward under his tenure is a remarkable package. You may notice that we are in border battles with our friends in Iowa and Wisconsin, and one of the signatures of their athletic programs is continuous high-quality leadership in their athletic department. Gary Barta has been the athletic director at Iowa for 12 years, Barry Alvarez, the athletic director and leader at Wisconsin for 14. Mark Coyle has the ability and the potential to continue the momentum that he's developed here, and I very much think this board should send him a signal of belief in his leadership and continuity through this presidential transition. By virtue of our negotiation and recognizing Athletic Director Coyle's desire to be in Minnesota, we have effected an extension of his contract without an increase in salary. He is in the normal salary pool as other senior leaders are, a continuity of a supplemental retirement at the same level that it is. So we have moved forward with no increase in current expenditures, which I think is a very good thing. We have, as you've seen in the materials, refined his separation agreement, should he decide to leave, to reduce over the course of time the payment that he would pay us. We also, of course, have, by this action, added to the term of the agreement and what we would owe him in a buyout. I do stress that the buyout amount that the university would provide is mitigated. He is required to look for work should he separate from the University of Minnesota, and the salary that he earns there would go against the amount of money that we would owe him would we terminate this contract. So given the stability, the progress, the need for momentum, and the accomplishments of the athletic director, Mark Coyle, I strongly recommend approval of this extension.
Thank you. At this time, I'll ask for a motion for the consent agenda.
Mr. Chair.
Regent Rocha.
Before the motion, I think it would be in order to ask about removal of any item from the consent report.
Okay, and I had asked that earlier, and if you want to voice that, you're welcome to. Yeah.
Okay. I would ask that the amendment that was just discussed be considered separately.
Okay, is there a second to? Does not need a second. Okay, thank you. So we are going to, let's get the consent agenda minus the athletic director one, Regent Rocha.
Correct.
We're asking a motion, and now Regent Lucas, I guess, would be at the time, a motion for the consent agenda less the athletic director employment agreement. I'm looking for a motion for that.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. So is there any discussion on the consent agenda minus the athletic director employment agreement? Is there any discussion on those items? If not, I'll move for approval of the consent agenda, less the athletic director employment agreement. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. I'll now look, before we discuss anything, for a motion to remove the employment agreement for the athletic director.
So moved.
Second.
And seconded. So we've got a motion and second. Is there discussion? Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No surprise, based on my request. The circumstances are unusual for us to be having this conversation here, and I my first approach or my first conversation here is going to be related to the need for action today when we are weeks from identifying the new CEO, the new president of the university. I note that this is a direct report to the president of the university. I noticed that I would note that President Kaler in his initial time actually made a transition in this position at the 7-month mark. This particular contract doesn't contemplate any service that is not already under contract during President Kaler's tenure. In fact, it actually goes to years 3, 4, and 5 of the yet to be identified president. All standards of governance would indicate that unless there is a compelling basis for expedition, that we would permit the new person, even prior to her or him coming on board, to have an opportunity to interact with this direct report, who I would suggest is the highest profile certainly from a public standpoint, direct report that will be on her or his staff. And so to that end, I move to postpone the consideration of this amendment until the December meeting.
We have a motion to postpone the employment agreement till December. Is there a second on that motion?
I'll second it.
Regent Simonson's. We have a motion on the floor then for postponement of the athletic director employment agreement. Is there discussion on the issue?
Mr. Chair.
Regent Rocha.
Yeah, as a debatable motion, I would just pose the question to President Kaler, to what extent would there be a dramatic advantage to proceeding prior to having an opportunity for your successor to even meet Mr. Coyle, who I am absolutely confident, as I'm sure everyone is around this table, that he will be favorably received and impressive and will have the support of the full board. To what extent would we be disadvantaged by having a consideration when that would be a possibility?
President Kaler, do you have a comment?
Thank you, Chair Anderson, Regent Rocha. It's interesting that you would believe strongly that the new president would greet Mr. Coyle warmly. I would suggest that that's also true, and that you as a board should send a message to Mr. Coyle that we have celebrated his success, want him to continue moving forward, and encourage his interaction with the new president. It's very much an opportunity to send a strong message to a valuable member of our community, Mr. Coyle, that he is appreciated and valued at the University of Minnesota. I think acting upon this would send exactly that message.
Regent Simonson had a question.
I too am very supportive of Director Coyle, and in a brief telephone conversation we had the other day, I was supportive of this thought, but I haven't had a chance to read through this. I don't know what the financial implications are. What are the opportunities for the next president coming in if he doesn't get along with Director Coyle? I can't imagine that, but if he doesn't, what's it going to cost us? So I'd like to have just the time. We don't have to wait for that president. I'd like to have time to review this and see what the cost implications are. That's all I'm asking.
Is there any other discussion? Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I mean, first of all, I'd like to thank Regent Rocha for his comments, on this item, which I think are thoughtful and certainly, merit the consideration of the board. I think it's very helpful. Where I come out on it is just because of what we've seen from the athletic director, his integrity, the tone that he set in the department, how quickly he moved to restructure and reorganize and strengthen the department in ways that I see as very positive. Some of the coaching, choices that were made, in such a positive way and so quickly, which I think indicates really a superlative degree of readiness, to move on these important decisions. I think actually this is a case where we do the new president a favor by, getting this done. It does provide a very clear statement of our support for the AD. And then maybe the last comment in the world I came from, and to I think the important point that Regent Rocha makes, these are situations where boards really have to think hard about what decisions do we want to leave to the incoming president, where do we want continuity in role, and I would say it wouldn't be uncommon at all for a board such as ours to say, here are a few where we're going to just keep them in place because we've seen enough and we think they're really going to help, and take that one, you've got enough to worry about coming in. Here are ones that we want you to decide. So I do think it's in our purview to make these decisions, to make some of these appointments now. And so with respect to the comments that Regent Rocha make, I'm very inclined to support the President's proposal here.
Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this, seeing as though we really only got a little heads up on it earlier in the week, but we didn't actually see the document until after 5 o'clock last night, and I think it would a decision like this really ties the hands of the incoming president. He or she would have to, under the current contract, not even with the amendment, basically have 2 years of the last 2 years of the original contract. And then by adding this on, we're out 5 years. And with the current tenure of Big Ten presidents being in the 5 to 6 year range, we may be in a position where the new person coming in wouldn't be able to select their own athletic director. And even if they did, then go fast forward to the next president, they would kind of be in the same situation with a long contract for an athletic director overhanging his or her presidency. So I really don't see the point in pushing this through today when nothing's going to change between now and December. We've all spoken highly of Director Coyle. I think we all expect that the new president would be comforted by the fact that there's a program that seems to be moving in the right direction. But on the other hand, I think that seeing as though we're in the middle of a search now, I think that any candidate looking at this job is probably going to be interested in kind of what's going on in athletics and should have the ability to make a decision on it. Even though that decision could be made several months from now, I don't think it's going to be a big factor here. And I take Mark at his word that Minnesota is a special place and that he wants to be in Minnesota, and to wait 2 months to have contract extensions or extension for years 3, 4, and 5 years from now, I think would be reasonable.
Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I would respectfully oppose the motion that's before us at this time to delay the extension contract of Mark Coyle. Some observations. Regents, when you have somebody that's one of the best in their business, in their industry, in their vocation, you need to keep that person. I would pay high compliments to President Kaler and his senior leadership team. Many of them are here today. One of them is beside me here now that he has assembled. And including in those top leaders is Mark Coyle. If you don't think for a moment that other institutions who are looking for athletic directors are not looking at a Mark Coyle, I invite you to think again. Just think about that. Between now and December, someone could come along and say, Mr. Coyle, we understand the following criteria, and we all know Mark, Mr. Coyle. He's one of the most dedicated university employees, not that others aren't, but in a very high-profile position. He has substantially changed the strategies, the budgetary process, the hiring of coaches, the emphasis of student athletics, student athletes across the wide spectrum, a man that's just highly, highly respected. And I see little value in us delaying this decision until December. Talking about the new president, who that might be, he or she, I would hope, and one of the things that I'm looking for as one of the senior members of the Regents is that this new president will be able to work with our senior leadership team and not drastically turn things in a different direction, because I think we're moving in a wonderful, productive direction as a university with faculty, students, and all. So I would, the tendency is during an interim, during a transition to say, let's just take a step back. We had this discussion last month on a senior level position. It was almost alleged over Dr. Kramer. Folks, let's keep going. Let's keep going. And when you have somebody the caliber of Mark Coyle, let's vote for the extension of his contract. Let's keep him here in Minnesota. Is he perfect? No, like the rest of us, none of us are perfect, but he certainly has done some wonderful and good things in the Department of Athletics. And so that, Regent Rocha, respectfully, you make some points, no doubt about it. But in this arena of debate, I would respectfully ask that we do not accept your motion of delay or postponement, and in turn that we would vote to extend the contract of Mark Coyle, our athletic director. Thank you very much.
We've got a lot of people that want to weigh in, so I'm just going to ask. We're just going to keep going down, and we'll get to the motion eventually. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly, I would consider the passage of this as a gift to the new president, whoever he or she may be. And as we look at what the pool looks like out there, we don't know who's interested in this job. But I think that anyone who's considering this job would find it comforting to know that there's peace in this particular valley, because this is the thing that upends many administrations, and I feel will really strengthen our search, actually.
Thank you, Regent Lucas. Regent Sviggum.
Mr. Chairman, just very quickly, I can't improve upon the comments of my previous three fellow regents, and so I will just stop there and say that I think this individual does things the right way, and I think we should go ahead.
Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I will pick up on the thread of comments I think that Regent Powell had, which is I too appreciate Regent Rocha's and Regent Shu's comments about how to position key leaders like this across a transitionary time frame. And I think we're doing a very thoughtful and comprehensive job of that as we look at things like the key academic leadership at the provost. This is one of those leaders, absolutely agree. But to pick up on Regent Lucas's comment, I think this creates stability and provides an asset to this new president that I think across the entire spectrum of the leadership decisions they're going to have to make, this is a good one to admittedly have made for the new president. If that doesn't work out, the buyout obligations are fully mitigated, and I believe would be mitigated. So I've thought about that too. And perhaps most importantly, in the context of your thoughtful proposed delay, I don't think we'll know anything in December that would actually be helpful. I think that the delay, to be meaningful, would have to be so long that we would put the continuity, certainty, and benefits of this athletic director and the athletic department he leads and the value that certainty brings at high risk, because it's going to be well into a new president's term before they could make a thoughtful decision, and that's longer than I'm willing to wait. So there's my thoughts, but again, picking up on Regent Johnson's comment, this is a very valid conversation to have about the timing of transition and key decisions, but I too support President Kaler's contract amendment here and would vote against the amendment to delay and in favor of the motion on the table.
We have Regent Cohen, Regent Simonson, Regent Beeson, and then we'll take the vote. Regent Cohen.
Thanks, Chair Anderson. I just want to also, I think it's really important to send a strong message to our athletic director that we support him, that we don't want him to leave, and I think that, and I don't see any advantage in delaying, and I think that the continuity that provides in a very difficult arena is really important. Thanks.
Regent Simonson.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. To me, it's not a question of supporting him. I support him very much. I appreciate President Kaler bringing this forward. My only point is we don't know this new president. Yeah, maybe it's continuity, maybe it's not. Maybe after a year on, he decides that Director Coyle is not the right one. Okay, so my only question is, and I'm trying to read this thing, is what's the buyout? If he says after a year, I want to move on with a new director, what's the buyout? I haven't read this. That's my only question.
President Kaler, do you have comments on that and the mitigation part of what would happen?
Chair Anderson, I do have those numbers somewhere in front of me. Basically, it is the term of his contract. So the number of years times his base salary. So that would be a 3-year. If we were, you have to pick a date. So multiply his base salary, which is about $865,000 now, times however many years are left in the contract. But again, his contract requires him to seek equivalent work, and it's mitigated. So given Director Coyle's position in the arc of his career, his enormously positive national image, it would take him about an hour and a half to find a new job, in my opinion. So I think the financial risk to the institution is negligible.
Answer your question, Regent Simonson. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have concerns about some of the elements in the agreement and some of the structure, but which I won't go into. But it's persuasive comments that some of you made about stability and the comparison to some of our other schools who have built major sports programs around stability at the athletic director's level. We had a stable tenure with athletic director Maturi. We had pretty good success with some of our major sports. And stability at the AD level doesn't assure success at the major sports level, but it almost has to be there. And I think sending the message to the next president that we believe in this person, that he's the right AD for us going forward, I think that is appropriate. So I would oppose the amendment to the motion.
Regent Rocha, last comment to your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe, based on the number of speakers, that I will have the opportunity to speak to the underlying agreement here shortly. But as it relates to the postponement, I appreciate the thoughtful comments, Regent Powell, Regent McMillan, others. But nobody addressed the question. In fact, when I asked the President the question before we went round robin, what the advantage is versus the lack of a disadvantage. I am concerned that we simply declare something to be a gift to the new president, and that then obviates any need to talk about whether we think this is something the new president should have buy-in on. We have stability. We have 2 years, 8 months on the current contract. This does not change the current contract. This reaches into the future in years 3, 4, and 5 of the new president. Now, I think that there's a real question to have in high-profile, very high compensation positions to ask whether 5-year contracts after someone's already on the ground. I understand sometimes you got to give longer contracts to get someone to leave where they are, especially in this context. But what we are doing in this situation without any opportunity for any ownership, privity, or otherwise between the new president and one of the highest profile direct reports in this person's stable of support, if things don't go. And I just for a bit of background, when we hired Rick Bay, we would have said all of the same things. When we hired McKinley Boston, we would have said all of the same things. In fact, I don't recall a lot of negative conversation about Mr. Coyle's predecessor, not until after the unfortunate circumstances. So I get it, and I support this athletic director. I think that he shows a tremendous amount of promise. But I think that if you're going to put a new president, and again, understand that if things are problematic at some point in the future, beyond what's already in contract, this new president is the one who's going to own it. President Kaler will be sipping a daiquiri on a country club patio at the time, and this person's going to have to deal with the fallout of substantial buyout issues and so on and so forth. I think just simply out of respect for that person, there should be an opportunity for that person to interact with this very key part of the administration. I'm disappointed that we're sitting here because now anything other than jingoistic support for this resolution would appear to be a criticism of the individual. It is not. It is absolutely not. Our leadership knew, both board and administration, that there was a concern and question about this, but nonetheless, here we are. And so now we're having this public conversation. I believe that it is appropriate for the incoming person. I think that if we tell candidates that this board is prone to provide them gifts of making determinations about their capacity to not just form their own administration, but to do it 3 and 4 and 5 years from now, I think that's an error. And I would ask that you support the motion to postpone.
Okay, the motion in front of us is to postpone the decision on the employment contract. So if you answer Affirmative, you're voting to postpone. So I'm going to ask the vote right now. All those in favor of postponing the employment agreement signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Nays have it. Here we sit. I would recommend, or I would receive a motion to accept the employment agreement at this time.
I believe it's on the floor already.
Has it been
The main
moved?
motion's on the,
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
So we're back to the main motion on the employment agreement.
Mr. Rocha. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Speaking to the main motion, again, if President Kaler would yield to a question, this has been presented to us, and granted, I haven't seen the, I was not provided, I should say, the base document, and so I'm only working off of these amendment provisions in my recollection of the previous agreement, and I received this last night. So I apologize if I'm not fully apprised of all the terms. However, I was led to understand from those of you with whom the President spoke that this reflects the fact that Mr. Coyle wants to stay at Minnesota. The terms of this agreement take us from a symmetrical relationship where if we terminate, we owe him the balance of the contract. If he terminates, his new employer or he owes us the balance of the contract. This reduces Mr. Coyle's obligations if he were to depart. And this goes to Regent Johnson's point. This actually goes into the last year of his current contract and cuts in half the obligation to compensate the university if Mr. Coyle were to leave his employment for other places. And then from the second year, from there it reduces down to 25%, and then in the final year of this, there's no buyout at all. Now, why is this significant, or why does this cause me a certain amount of caution? Well, as a generation of Minnesotans that has not lived during a period when we have won a Big Ten title in football, I'm hypersensitive to the prospect of a revolving door of leadership when we have opportunities for success. I recall the disappointment out cleaning horse stalls when Lou Holtz was bringing the football team back to success and then, of course, left for other circumstances. And so when I think about the potential success for this particular position, I say, first of all, if we actually objectively analyze where we are, I think Mark's great. I think Director Coyle is fantastic. He's great to work with. He's got a wonderful capacity with people. And if you look at his record, he's done a very good job of maintaining the academic success that was here when he came in. He's made some very positive reforms, and he's made some good coaching hires, but they still haven't yet produced, in terms of the high-profile sports and revenue. We have revenue issues. We still are working to make our way in the marquee sports. If we have that success, it's going to come in 2, perhaps 3 years from now. That's the same time that this contract drops our ability to retain, at least contractually, to retain our athletic director. However, if we don't achieve the success, and we've been through that cycle where we've had very talented people, but circumstances are such, and maybe there's some unexpected unpleasantries that have, are no fault of the athletic director, we will continue to have this obligation, again, throughout the term of the next president. So my question is to President Kaler, if your representation is that this is a reflection of both the university wanting to keep Mr. Coyle and Mr. Coyle wanting to stay here, why are we leaving the symmetrical relationship of buyout and moving to a point where he can much more easily, or a new suitor can much more easily buy out the contract were we to achieve success in the coming years?
Chair,
President Kaler, would you want to answer that, or do we want?
Regent Rocha, very quickly, these extensions, as most contracts are the product of a negotiation. We sought to extend Athletic Director Coyle's contract. Typically, an extension of a contract includes an increase in salary. The negotiation was to not increase his salary, but to provide a give, if you will on the separation portion of the contract for him, recognizing some uncertainty with the presidential transition, allowing him a bit of freedom, and again achieving it at no additional salary cost for the university. That was important to him, and again, at the end of the day, we want to have people employed as economically as possible. this, should the contract work well, will be at no cost to the university. That seemed to me to be a good deal.
Mr. Chair, follow-up.
Regent Roshan.
Thank you. I guess I understand the general concept. However, I predict that if we have the kind of success that this board would expect us to have and is seeking for us to have, we will be renegotiating those years if we have success. If we don't have success, we're on the hook. And I'm concerned that anybody would consider that flexibility or the freedom as you described it. If freedom is a value, then it's not a commitment that we're in this together for the next 5 years. And I would find this to be a bit of a threat of our ability to continue that upward progression without being picked off by perhaps a larger, deeper pocketed suitor. And I don't support the language of this contract.
Okay, with that discussion, if there's no further discussion, I will call the vote. The motion in front of me, I'm just reminding myself, is for the employment agreement of Athletic Director Coyle. So those in favor of approving the extension of the employment agreement for Athletic Director Coyle, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Motion carries. The last thing on the agenda is items of information. I think we're a little over time right now, but if you can look at them, it's a chart of all the real estate transactions in the last year. So with that, who would like to move that we adjourn?
So move.
Second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Carried. Thank you.